Billionaire CEO enters the wrong room at a resort. Seconds later, he freezes in shock. What happens next changes his life forever. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Christopher Gray stepped out of the sleek black SUV into the brisk mountain air of Aspen, Colorado. He paused for a moment, allowing himself to admire the breathtaking scenery, the powdered slopes, the towering fir trees, and the golden hue of the late afternoon sun. There was a certain hush on the snowy peaks, an almost reverent silence that felt foreign to him, given his usual environment of buzzing boardrooms and bustling city streets. Yet he was here on business, even if this place promised a brief respite from his daily pressures. He was a tall man of 45, with hair that had started to grey along the temples, matching his somber grey suit. Telltale signs of fatigue shadowed his dark eyes. They hinted at the relentless schedule he'd been keeping for the past weeks, preparing for the major tech conference that had just wrapped up. As CEO of Graytech, an innovative technology conglomerate founded decades ago by his late father, Christopher bore the weight of legacy like a well-tailored but heavy coat. Everyone expected him to be as visionary as John Gray had once been. Inside the resort's opulent lobby, the low hum of conversation mingled with the crackling of a stone fireplace. Gold and burgundy rugs lined the polished floor, and porters in matching uniforms hurried guests toward the reception desk. Christopher stood near a large portrait of the Rockies, waiting for his turn to check in, and reflected on the intense negotiations from the conference. So much was riding on this potential merger: stock prices, employee livelihoods, and, above all, his father's name. Nothing terrified him more than failing the standard his father had set, especially after what had happened years ago, when rumors of financial impropriety had tainted the Gray name. Even after 15 years, Christopher still wrestled with the shadows of that scandal. He rarely spoke of it to anyone, not even to his mother, Margaret Gray, who now lived a quiet life in Boston. She had insisted for decades that John Gray was innocent, but some doubts had always lingered at the edges of Christopher's mind. The official stories claimed his father died of a sudden heart attack brought on by stress. But Christopher suspected that humiliation and heartbreak, triggered by the public allegations, played an equally devastating role. Now, as CEO, Christopher vowed to never let such a downfall happen again. While waiting in line, Christopher received a text from Randall Fisher, Graytech's chief financial officer. "Any update on the final signatures?" it read. Christopher felt a slight twinge of annoyance. Randall could be persistent, even overbearing, but he had been loyal to Graytech for years. At least, that was how it appeared. Christopher quickly typed back, "Still reviewing the documents. I'll keep you posted." He slipped his phone into his jacket and offered a tight smile to the friendly receptionist, who gestured him forward. "Welcome to the Grand Summit Resort, Mr. Gray," she said, handing him a plastic keycard. "Room 1408 in the West Wing. If you need anything, ski passes, dining recommendations, feel free to let us know." He thanked her, pocketed the key, and rolled his small suitcase toward the elevators. The place was laid out like a labyrinth, with hallways branching off in multiple directions, each lined with decorative sconces shaped like pine cones. Passing an indoor fountain trickling gently into a stone basin, Christopher felt a pull in his chest, something akin to longing for the simpler times he barely remembered from childhood. Growing up, Aspen had been a winter destination for the Gray family, a place where he once experienced carefree ski lessons and hot cocoa by the fire. Now, the hallway leading to the West Wing was hushed, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. Each door bore a brass number, and Christopher scanned them for 1408. He was so tired that the numbers began to blur. A wave of exhaustion hit him, The conference had run overtime, followed by a last-minute dinner with potential partners. All he wanted now was to collapse on a bed and maybe, just maybe, sleep through the next morning. Turning a corner, he finally spotted a door labeled 1408. In his haze, Christopher barely noticed that the digital lock screen flickered strangely. The small light didn't register the card immediately. He tried again, and the door beeped. Opening it quietly, he stepped inside. It was dark, only a distant glow spilled from a lamp near the sofa. Without switching on the overhead light, Christopher muttered something about how large the suite was. He set his suitcase down and tugged at his tie, relief flooding him as he anticipated a quick shower and then bed. But a fleeting sense of unease nagged at him, though he couldn't yet say why. Perhaps it was the slight chill or the faint smell of stale coffee. Something felt off, as if he were intruding in a private space. He brushed the feeling aside. Maybe housekeeping just hadn't aired the room out properly. He made his way toward what he presumed was the bedroom. In the dim glow, he reached for a switch on the wall, fully expecting to see a tidy, if ordinary, hotel room. When light finally flooded the space, Christopher froze. Papers were scattered across the carpet. A half-open laptop blinked on a small writing desk, and there, on the floor, lay a figure, a woman, completely still. The shock jolted him awake more effectively than the crisp mountain air outside. In an instant, he realized this was not his room. Christopher stood at the threshold, heart pounding in his ears. For several moments, he could only stare at the woman on the floor, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. A dizzying thought passed through his mind. Was she hurt? Unconscious? Worse? Quickly, he dropped to one knee beside her. "Ma'am, miss," he asked softly, pressing two shaking fingers to her neck. Relief coursed through him when he felt a pulse. Her skin was cold, though, and her short auburn hair lay matted against her forehead, as if she'd collapsed unexpectedly. The entire scene was surreal. The scattered papers, the faint hum of a laptop, the empty coffee cup on the desk. It was clear she'd been working on something important before she passed out. With trembling caution, Christopher nudged her shoulder. "Hey," he tried again, slightly louder. The woman didn't stir. He checked for any sign of injury. No obvious bleeding or bruises, though a few sheets of paper had crumpled under her torso. Scraps of text leaped out at him. Tax evasion, secret account, grey tech. Seeing his company's name snared his attention, so he carefully picked up a page. Names were listed: Randall Fisher, 2 board members he recognized, and sums of money that made his stomach roil. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway pulled his focus from the document. He thought he heard muffled voices, possibly men's voices. Panic leapt into his throat. Whoever these people were, he definitely didn't want to be caught standing over an unconscious woman in what was clearly not his hotel suite. Could they be her friends checking in on her? Or could they be something far more dangerous? Christopher acted on instinct. He snatched his phone from his pocket and snapped a few quick pictures of the documents, uncertain why he was doing it. A part of him realized that if there was wrongdoing involving his CFO and his board, he needed evidence, however fragmentary. Another part of him felt sheer confusion and alarm, helping this stranger or protecting himself, or both. He shoved his phone away, gently slid his arms under the woman's shoulders, and tried to lift her into a sitting position. "Wake up," he whispered urgently, glancing at the door. The voices outside grew clearer, a man's muffled laugh and the scuff of shoes on carpet. They were close, perhaps just a few feet from the room. The digital lock on the door blinked. Someone must have a key. Christopher's pulse hammered in his temples as he made a split-second decision. He hoisted the woman up, hooking her arm around his shoulders. She was slender, but carrying a limp body was no easy task. As quietly as possible, he guided her behind a tall, half-drawn curtain near the window. If they were going to barge in, maybe they wouldn't immediately spot them. The door beeped again, then clicked open. Christopher held his breath, arms trembling from the weight of the unconscious stranger. He peered around the curtain, catching a glimpse of two men stepping into the suite. One wore a dark overcoat, the other a tailored blazer. Their tone was hushed but agitated. "I told you she's got the files here," one of them muttered. "We need them before she sends them to her editor." The other hissed, "Did you see her in the lobby? She might still be—" He paused abruptly, spotting the scattered paperwork. "Damn it! Where is she?" Christopher felt the woman shift slightly in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion and fear. She looked at Christopher, then at the men in the suite. In an instant, her gaze sharpened, and she mouthed something Christopher couldn't fully read, maybe go or hide. Tension radiated from her trembling body. The men fanned out, searching the corners of the suite. One approached the laptop. "It's still on," he said, voice tight. "She wouldn't have left without this." Christopher's muscles burned from holding her, and he realized they couldn't stay hidden forever. The only exit was the same door those men had used. The bathroom was too small and obvious. An idea flickered in his mind, the connecting door to the adjacent room, a common feature in many hotels. If it was unlocked or if his key could somehow open it, they might slip out that way. He gently eased the woman to her feet, noticing how she clenched her jaw, clearly trying not to make a sound. They edged along the wall, remaining behind thick drapes. The men were still rummaging, cursing under their breath as they realized key documents were missing. Christopher's heart thumped wildly. Another few steps, and they reached a door with a discreet brass handle labeled "Connecting Suite." Summoning his courage, Christopher twisted the knob. It clicked, but the door remained locked. The woman, still unsteady, clutched at his arm, her expression pleading. He glanced at the plastic keycard he still clutched in his free hand. Could it possibly open this door? It was a gamble, but there was no time to second-guess. The men's voices grew louder again, and footsteps padded closer. Christopher swiped the card against the small electronic panel. By some miracle or glitch, the lock beeped and turned green. He pulled the door open just enough for both of them to slip through. They entered another dimly lit room, equally luxurious but thankfully unoccupied. Softly, Christopher closed the connecting door behind them, praying the men wouldn't notice in time. As soon as he felt reasonably safe, Christopher exhaled, still supporting the woman. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, her eyes reflecting gratitude and worry. Before she could speak, they both heard movement from the other side. The men had realized something was wrong, but for now, at least, they had escaped discovery. That was how Christopher Gray's night, meant for rest and recovery, turned into something that felt more like a clandestine mission. He didn't know who this woman was, or why she had evidence implicating his trusted CFO in illegal schemes. But he did know his life would never be the same. Christopher helped the woman onto the sofa in the new suite, which smelled faintly of lavender. While she tried to steady her breathing, he leaned against the door, listening for any sign that the two intruders had discovered their trail. His heart still pounded, but the corridor beyond the connecting door sounded quiet now, except for a faint mumble of frustration. He hoped they would give up soon. Finally, he turned his attention to her. The woman ran a trembling hand through her hair, pushing away loose strands. In the soft glow of a small lamp, Christopher noticed she appeared to be around his age, maybe early 40s, with tired but resolute eyes. There was a tension in her posture that suggested a fierce determination beneath her current frailty. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice low. "I'm sorry if I startled you, but those men—" She held up a hand, still catching her breath. I'm Hannah," she managed, voice shaky. "Thank you for helping me." Her gaze drifted to the door, worry etched in her features. "They wanted my documents. They've been following me since yesterday." Christopher nodded, unsure what else to say. The mention of documents made his stomach tighten. In her room, he had seen references to grey tech, to suspicious financial transactions, even to names he recognized. He swallowed hard. "I saw some of your files. They mentioned my company." "Did you, break in somewhere?" Hannah shook her head. "Not exactly. I'm a journalist." Her voice took on a defensive edge. "I was investigating a story, and my source arranged for me to access certain records. Those men must be part of the group trying to silence it." Christopher sank onto the arm of a chair, mind reeling. He massaged the bridge of his nose, momentarily closing his eyes. A journalist investigating grey tech. That spelled trouble on every level. He thought of Randall's frequent texts, the big merger, his father's memory. The last thing he wanted was another headline tarnishing the grey name. Yet he couldn't ignore what he'd seen, figures that suggested money laundering or tax evasion. Real crimes, real stakes. He regarded Hannah warily. "How deep does this go?" Her eyes flashed. "Deeper than you realize. I've been piecing it together for months. Someone at Greytech, high up, has been funneling money into shell companies, evading taxes, maybe siphoning funds. If I can expose it, I can force them to face legal consequences." Christopher exhaled, a mixture of anger and anxiety. "Do you have any idea who's behind it?" She pushed herself upright, regaining some composure. "I suspect a few top executives, including your CFO, Randall Fisher, and at least 2 board members. But it's bigger than just them. I think there are outside investors involved too. The evidence is all in my room, or was," she added bitterly, glancing at the connecting door. "They must have found my location and come after me to steal or destroy it." Outside, the wind howled softly against the window, and Christopher felt a distinct chill. Could Randall really be capable of such a betrayal? He tried to reason with himself. Randall had been with the company for years, guiding it through expansions and acquisitions, but Christopher also remembered a few odd discrepancies in the financial reports. Each time, Randall had explained them away. Hannah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You don't seem surprised to hear it's possible. Maybe you've noticed something off." He hesitated. Little things, financial statements that didn't match up at first glance. "I questioned them, and Randall always had an explanation. I never dug deeper. Maybe I didn't want to. The company was thriving. I didn't want to stir up more controversy, especially not after everything that happened with my father." Her expression shifted at the mention of Christopher's father. Almost imperceptibly, she winced, as though hearing the name Gray brought up old memories for her too. But he didn't notice. He was lost in his own swirl of doubts, recalling how fiercely he had defended his family's honor in the past. He pressed a hand to his forehead. "If what you're saying is true, I can't just ignore it. But if we go public, the fallout could be massive. My employees, my shareholders, the entire company could collapse." Hannah breathed deeply. "I know. But if this is real, and trust me, it is, staying silent would be worse. You'd become complicit, especially once you've seen the evidence." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Christopher shifted, eyeing the door again. "We can't stay here," he said, lowering his voice. "Those men might check the connecting suite soon. You can barely stand. Let's see if we can at least get back into the hallway or somewhere safer." Hannah nodded, though Christopher could see her nerves were frayed. He felt the same, a potent blend of fear and responsibility swirling inside him. He'd stumbled into this situation by accident, but now he faced a decision that would test not only his moral compass, but also his willingness to confront ghosts from the past. Could he risk wrecking the company his father built, or was the greater risk allowing this corruption to continue? Picking up the keycard and quietly slipping it into his pocket, Christopher motioned for Hannah to follow. She leaned on him for support. Together, they crept out of the room, determined to find a safe place to regroup. Neither knew how dangerous the path ahead might be, but the gravity of what they had discovered weighed on them both. Christopher found a deserted service corridor behind the resort's banquet halls, where staff typically moved between kitchens and storage rooms. Dim overhead lights flickered against the grey walls, and the faint smell of detergent hung in the air. Hannah limped slightly, each step an effort, but she forced herself to stay upright. Adrenaline still coursed through Christopher's veins, keeping his exhaustion at bay. They paused near a metal exit door with a neon emergency-only sign. Outside, the snow blew in gusts, swirling under a pale moon. Christopher turned to Hannah, voice hushed. "We can't just wander around all night. We need a plan." She leaned against the wall, catching her breath. "I need to retrieve my evidence. The digital backups, my notes, everything. That's the only way to protect myself. And you." He frowned. "Protect me. I never asked to be involved." She met his gaze, eyes dark and unwavering. "You took photos of those documents. If these people know that, your involvement is sealed, whether you like it or not." A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in Christopher's chest. He had built a life trying to avoid the mistakes and scandals that once threatened his family legacy, yet here he was, on the brink of another corporate nightmare. "We could go to the resort manager or the police," he suggested, though uncertainty tinged his voice. "Let them handle whoever those men are." Hannah shook her head adamantly. "They might be watching the main exits, and local police could be influenced or bought off by powerful businessmen. This is a huge story, Christopher. It involves people with money, connections. You saw how far they were willing to go." She pressed her lips into a thin line. "The best chance is for me to contact my editor or someone I trust outside this resort. But I need my laptop and external drives first." Christopher raked a hand through his hair, stepping back to think. The memories of his father's collapse into scandal still tormented him. The hushed phone calls, the ominous headlines, and finally, the funeral that came too soon. He had vowed never to let anything so tragic happen again. But if his CFO truly was orchestrating some illegal scheme, ignoring it would be wrong. At that moment, faint footsteps echoed from around the corner. Hannah's gaze locked on Christopher's, panic in her eyes. They pressed themselves against the wall, hearts pounding. A pair of resort staff in uniforms shuffled past, pushing a cart of folded linens. Relieved that it wasn't the men from before, Christopher exhaled slowly. Hannah whispered, "We can't stay here long. They might search the entire resort if they're desperate." Christopher nodded. "We need a quiet place where you can recover and figure out our next steps." They slipped out of the service corridor and followed a narrow set of stairs that led to a small lounge area near the top floor. The lounge was cozy, with a vending machine humming in the corner and a few armchairs clustered around a coffee table. Thankfully, it was empty. They sank into chairs across from each other, and Hannah rubbed her temples. "Thank you," she murmured. "I know you didn't have to do any of this. You could have just walked away." He forced a half smile. "Yeah, well, that's not who I am." He paused. "At least I hope it's not." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside the window, the moonlit mountain slopes glistened, a stark contrast to the shadows of their predicament. Finally, Hannah cleared her throat and asked, "Do you trust Randall Fisher?" Christopher leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "He's always been persistent, tactically smart. He was close to my father. After Dad passed, Randall helped me navigate the transition into the CEO role. I never questioned his loyalty. Maybe I should have." Hannah studied him. This sort of crime doesn't happen overnight. It's been building for years, so either he's behind it or he's turning a blind eye. The thought made Christopher's jaw tighten. If he's behind it, I can't even begin to imagine the damage it'll do to Greytech once it's exposed. Hannah glanced down, hesitating. Christopher, I know what it's like to bring a story to light and watch people's reputations crumble. It's never easy, but if there's real corruption, you'd want it rooted out, right? If the company is worth saving, better to tear out the rot now. Her words stirred a turmoil inside him. He recalled his father's old adage, integrity is the soul of any enterprise. Perhaps John Gray had known the cost of losing that integrity. Christopher's gaze shifted to the soft glow of the lamp above them. I need proof, he said quietly. Proof I can't ignore, so I don't turn a blind eye and pretend everything's fine. Hannah nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. Then we need my laptop and backup drives. They have more comprehensive documentation. With those, you'll see the full extent of the fraud. Christopher rose, pushing the chair back gently. Let's do it. But we have to be careful. We don't know how many people are involved or how far they'll go. Steadying herself, Hannah stood. Though she was still pale, a new strength flickered in her eyes. We'll find a way, she said softly. They left the lounge, forging a cautious path through hushed corridors. Each step carried the weight of unraveling truths that could shake everything Christopher believed about Greytech and about the man he had inherited the company from. The pressure was mounting, and he felt the tremor of that burden in every breath. Yet a small spark of determination kindled in his chest, a willingness to face what lay ahead, even if it meant tearing down walls he once thought unassailable. Christopher guided Hannah to a deserted corner near an indoor balcony overlooking the resort's grand lobby. Below, guests mingled by the fireplace, oblivious to the danger lurking in the corridors above. A gentle piano melody floated from the lounge bar, creating a surreal contrast to their tense reality. We could try the cafe on the first floor, Christopher suggested quietly. It's open all night, and it's usually not too crowded at this hour. Maybe we can rest there for a moment and figure out how to retrieve your things. Hannah nodded. Sounds good. With people around, it might be safer. And if anyone is watching, they'll see us just grabbing coffee. They moved carefully toward the elevators, each step filled with caution. The elevator ride down felt endless. Christopher's mind spun with possibilities for what might happen next. He knew if he got too deeply involved, he risked everything, his reputation, his fortune, and the livelihoods of thousands of employees. But ignoring this crisis, that might be an even greater betrayal of all he claimed to stand for. Once they reached the cafe, a cozy nook with plush armchairs and warm lighting, Christopher scanned the room. Only a few patrons sat scattered among the tables. A gray-haired couple sipped hot tea while a lone businessman tapped away at his laptop. A friendly barista, sporting a green apron, offered a welcoming smile but didn't seem to recognize either of them. Hannah lowered herself into a corner booth with a sigh of relief. Christopher ordered 2 coffees, black for himself and a decaf for her at her request. When he returned, he found her massaging her wrist as she tried to steady a subtle tremor in her hand. You sure you're okay? He asked, sliding her cup toward her. She shrugged, managing a faint smile. Just a bit shaken. A few hours ago, I was certain I had everything under control. I never expected to be knocked out or chased through a hotel by... I'm not even sure who they are. Hired muscle, probably. Christopher let silence settle between them for a moment as they both sipped their coffee. Eventually, he cleared his throat. Why were you investigating Greytech in particular? I mean, there are plenty of big corporations out there. Her expression shifted, as though she'd stepped into a painful memory. Originally, I was following a lead about questionable offshore accounts connected to tech firms. When I dug deeper, Randall Fisher's name kept popping up. Then I found references to your father, John Gray, from about 15 years ago. Financial anomalies that got brushed under the rug. A bitter knot formed in Christopher's stomach. 15 years ago, that was when his father's reputation had been dragged through the mud by the press. He braced himself, not wanting to revisit that difficult chapter of his life. "We had a scandal back then," he admitted, voice subdued. "My father always insisted he was innocent, that he had no part in any illegal dealings. But the stress took a toll." He stared at the swirling steam rising from his coffee. "He died of a heart attack not long after." Hannah lowered her gaze. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. "I'm sorry," she managed quietly. "I know how damaging scandals can be." He nodded but said nothing further, not wanting to dwell on it. "So you think Randall might have been orchestrating something even back then?" She tapped her cup, restless. "It's possible. Or he found a way to cover it up after your father died. Either way, it's been simmering under the surface all these years." Christopher leaned back, his shoulders heavy with dread. This conversation only confirmed the seriousness of the situation. Whatever personal grief he carried for his father, that story was woven into a much larger tapestry of corruption, one he couldn't ignore now that he'd glimpsed it. "So," Hannah said, looking at him earnestly, "are you willing to help me expose this, no matter the fallout? Because once we go down that road, there's no turning back. Those men upstairs aren't going to just step aside." He stared at his coffee, wrestling with his conscience. The Grey-Tech name, the employees, the dream his father built. Everything felt like it was dangling on a precarious edge. But the alternative, looking away while criminals destroyed the integrity of his company. "I need to see the rest of your evidence," he said at last, meeting her gaze. "If it's as damning as what I've seen, I won't let it continue. But I'm also not going to blow the place up without solid proof." Hannah's eyes glinted with cautious relief. "That's enough for now," she replied. "We'll retrieve my laptop and drives. Then we can decide on our next move." A weighty silence fell. In the background, the barista ground fresh beans, the machine hissing softly. Somewhere by the fireplace, the older couple laughed at a private joke. Everything seemed so normal, yet Christopher felt as though an invisible line had been crossed. He had made a tentative decision to place one foot into the unknown, still uncertain if he had the courage to see it through. After a moment, Hannah offered the faintest smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. "I don't know if I could do this alone." Christopher returned a nod, stirring his coffee absently. Despite the pulse of anxiety that threaded through his veins, a flicker of determination began to grow. He would not abandon everything his family once stood for, nor would he let fear dictate his actions. The cost might be high, but the price of silence, he realized, would be far greater. They finished their drinks in pensive quiet, both aware that this uneasy alliance might be all that stood between truth and the sweeping power of those who thrived in the shadows. Christopher and Hannah sat in the dimly lit cafe a while longer, occasionally casting glances at the few patrons who sipped coffee or tapped on their phones. Their whispered conversation had settled into an uneasy lull, both of them silently weighing the risks ahead. At last, Christopher checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. "We can't just wait here forever," he said. "We need to retrieve your laptop and drives before whoever's after you realizes where we might go next." Hannah brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her voice quiet but firm. "Let's head back upstairs. I left my gear stashed in the closet of the same suite, where you found me. Hopefully, those men didn't discover it." Christopher pursed his lips. "That's risky. If they're still around, we could walk right into them." She offered a grim smile. "They might have left if they didn't find what they were looking for. But it's a gamble either way." As they rose to leave, the barista stepped over. "Last call for coffee?" she asked kindly, her green apron rustling. Christopher hesitated, then shook his head. "No, thanks," he said, returning a polite nod. He felt a pang of guilt for lying to the unsuspecting staff, who had no idea about the danger that lurked in the same building. They slipped out of the cafe and made their way back to the elevator bay. Hannah stiffened, halting when she spotted a tall man in a dark suit just beyond the escalators. "That's not one of them, is it?" she asked, breath hitching. Christopher squinted. "I don't think so." Still, Hannah took no chances. She motioned for Christopher to follow her along a side corridor that led to the resort's conference rooms. "I found a service elevator behind these ballrooms earlier," she explained. They reached a broad double door labeled "Staff Only." Hannah tugged it open, revealing a dim hall with cleaning supplies and a freight elevator at the end. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper inside, but they heard no immediate sign of the men who attacked her. Inside the freight elevator, Hannah pressed the button for the 14th floor. The machine lurched and began a steady ascent. Anxiety churned in Christopher's gut, the confined space amplifying his sense of vulnerability. He glanced at the flickering ceiling light, recalling how differently this evening might have gone if he'd just opened the right hotel door in the first place. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a narrow corridor that intersected with the main hallway on the 14th floor. At the juncture stood a figure that instantly put Christopher on edge, a man in his mid-60s with silver hair brushed neatly back, wearing a casual tweed jacket. The man spun around at their approach, startled. "Mr. Gray," he said, surprise coloring his tone, "what are you doing here at this hour?" It took Christopher a moment to register the face. "Quentin?" he asked, blinking. Quentin Ross had once been an external auditor brought in by Christopher's father. They hadn't been in direct contact for years, but Christopher recalled him as a thorough, precise figure who once tried to warn John Gray of potential internal fraud. Quentin's warnings had been dismissed back then, overshadowed by the scandal that erupted soon after. Hannah looked uneasy. "Friend of yours," she whispered. Christopher spoke hesitantly. "Quentin Ross used to work with my father. He's an accountant and consultant." Quentin's gaze flickered between the two, his posture tense. "I came here for the business conference. I was hoping to speak with you regarding some concerns I've heard about Grey Tech, but you vanished after the closing session." Hannah and Christopher exchanged quick, wary glances. There was little time to sort out friend from foe, but something about Quentin's earnest expression and recollection of the old days made Christopher believe he could be trusted, at least more than random strangers lurking around. "Quentin," Christopher began, voice low, "we're in trouble. We need your help. There's a situation involving our CFO, possibly some board members, illegal financial dealings." Quentin's brow furrowed. "I suspected as much. The rumor mill has been churning ever since Grey Tech's finances started showing irregularities. Your father once told me, when the numbers don't add up, never ignore the discrepancy." Hannah spoke up, her tone brisk but respectful. "I'm Hannah Sullivan, investigative journalist. We have evidence of fraud connected to Grey Tech. We need to retrieve my hardware from a suite, quickly and quietly." Quentin nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He glanced around. "This floor isn't safe right now. Let me help." They huddled together in the corridor, voices kept low. Quentin offered to create a small diversion if needed, perhaps head down the main hall, drawing attention while Christopher and Hannah slipped back into the ill-fated suite. Hannah pressed a shaky hand to her temple. "All right, we'll try it, but we have to be fast." Christopher gave a silent nod of thanks to Quentin before turning to Hannah. "Once we get your things, I want you to show me everything you've got. Files, spreadsheets, communications. I need a full picture before making any move." "Deal," she agreed, resolutely. Quentin took a step forward, then paused to rest a hand on Christopher's shoulder. his tone softened, almost paternal. "Your father wasn't perfect, Christopher, but he valued honesty. If these allegations are true, you have no choice but to act." No matter how painful, Christopher swallowed hard, memories of his father swirling in his mind. "I know," he murmured, gazing down the corridor. "I just hope we're not too late." With that, Quentin headed off, his footsteps echoing as he rounded the corner into the main hallway. Christopher and Hannah exchanged a look of both determination and dread before they too slipped out of the service corridor. By chance or by destiny, they now had a guide, someone who had once sounded warnings that went unheeded. Perhaps this time, Christopher thought, history would not repeat itself. Using Quentin's diversion, Christopher and Hannah navigated the opulent hallway on the 14th floor. The warm glow of sconces against the patterned wallpaper gave the impression of a serene, upscale hotel, yet tension simmered just beneath the surface. Their steps were quick but cautious, each footfall a reminder that they were no longer operating within the safety of normal business dealings. As they approached the suite's door, Hannah clutched Christopher's arm. "Remember, my laptop bag is hidden in the bedroom closet. If they've found it, we'll need to think of something else." Christopher nodded, silently praying the men who'd threatened her had left. He leaned close to the door, ears straining for any sound. Hearing nothing, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. The small twist in his stomach told him it should have been locked. Hannah mouthed, "Stay behind me." But Christopher was larger and instinctively placed himself in front. Slowly, they crept inside, flicking on only a narrow beam from Christopher's phone flashlight. The suite looked disheveled, papers strewn across the table, drawers left ajar, chairs knocked over. However, Christopher felt a strange relief that the men were nowhere in sight. Possibly they had searched thoroughly and left in frustration. Hannah carefully moved to the bedroom closet, rummaging through winter coats hanging there. At last, she pulled out a small black backpack, her eyes lit up, relief evident on her face. "It's here," she whispered triumphantly. Christopher exhaled, shoulders easing. "Good. Let's get out of here." They retraced their steps, slipping back into the hallway. From somewhere at the other end of the floor came a distant voice. Perhaps Quentin, distracting any potential watchers. Hannah led Christopher toward the service corridor once again, her laptop bag clutched securely. Their journey ended in the same deserted lounge from earlier, the small space where they could momentarily catch their breath. Hannah set the backpack on a low table and retrieved a sleek laptop and 2 external hard drives. She booted it up, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. While waiting, Christopher took a seat, mind churning with conflicting thoughts. Memories of his father swirled. John Gray, steadfast in his belief that integrity was essential, even as he faced allegations that tarnished his name. Had Christopher's desire to protect the Gray legacy blinded him to warning signs about Randall and others? Hannah's voice snapped him back to the present. "I have spreadsheets detailing transactions, shell accounts, and email correspondence linking certain Gray Tech officers to illicit deals." She paused to fix Christopher with a somber gaze. "Enough to bring them down, if it goes public." The weight in her words pressed on Christopher's chest. "Show me," he said quietly. She opened a folder labeled Gray Tech Investigation. Rows and columns of numbers spilled across the screen, referencing wire transfers, corporate structures, and suspicious tax entries. Emails scrolled by, with Randall Fisher's name appearing repeatedly. Randall's words were often vague, but they seemed to reference hush payments and coded language about managing risk. Christopher's face tightened in anger. This is worse than I imagined." Hannah nodded grimly. "It's extensive. And it's not just Randall. 2 board members, an external partner, and a law firm appear to be involved. Money from these shell companies has been funneled back into Greytech's official accounts, but the sums never quite match. Tax liabilities vanish with no paper trail. He rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache. If this breaks, the stock could plummet. People will lose faith in the company. He thought of the thousands of employees worldwide who depended on Greytech for a paycheck. Factories in the Midwest, research teams in Silicon Valley, call centers in the Southwest. The ripple effects would be devastating. Yet letting fraud continue would be an even deeper betrayal. Hannah's tone softened. I've seen it before. Mass layoffs, reorganizations. But there's also a chance that with proper leadership and legal cooperation, the company can be salvaged, rid of the guilty parties. The worst case is if everything stays hidden, festering until it erupts in an even bigger scandal. His jaw clenched. I need to talk to my mother, he murmured. She knew my father better than anyone. Maybe she knows something about Randall we've missed. Hannah hesitated. I understand, but we can't delay. The men we ran from could be regrouping right now. Christopher realized she was right. His old life, the ordinary world of board meetings, share prices, and polished corporate dinners, felt distant. He was crossing a threshold into a space where truth trumped tradition, and the stakes were incredibly high. Okay, he said, lifting his gaze to hers. Let's do this. We'll find a secure place to call my mother. Then, with Quentin's help, we'll figure out our next move. There's no going back, is there? Hannah shook her head gently, eyes reflecting empathy and determination. No, there isn't. So there, in that quiet lounge near midnight, Christopher Gray bid a silent farewell to the safe confines of his old existence. Together with Hannah, he was stepping into a new realm, one defined by moral peril and the pursuit of truth, even if it meant unraveling everything he believed about his family legacy. Quentin discreetly reunited with Christopher and Hannah, leading them back down a seldom-used stairwell. The resort's ambience changed as they descended, less glitzy and more utilitarian, with concrete walls and exposed pipes. Their footsteps echoed in the claustrophobic space. "Where are we going?" Christopher asked, glancing at Quentin's serious expression. "I booked a small meeting room earlier to review some documents," Quentin explained. "It's off the main convention area. Technically, the conference ended this afternoon, so it should be vacant. We'll have privacy there." At the bottom of the stairwell, they emerged into a corridor lined with large double doors labeled with signs like Summit Hall, Timberline Banquet, and Snowmass Boardroom. Quentin stopped at a nondescript door without a sign. Producing a key card, he swiped it and ushered them inside. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning fluid. Beige walls, a long wooden table, and an overhead projector setup lent it the impersonal atmosphere of countless business meetings. Yet now it felt like a clandestine hideout. Quentin locked the door behind them. "We should be safe here for a while. As far as anyone knows, this room isn't booked until tomorrow." Hannah placed her black backpack on the table, retrieving her laptop once again. She cast an anxious glance at Christopher. "We have to assume those men are either searching for us or have reported back to the real masterminds. Randall will suspect something is off if he can't reach you soon." Christopher's phone buzzed as if on cue. The caller ID read Randall Fisher. His stomach knotted. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. After a beat, he silenced it. "I'm not ready to confront him yet." "I need more clarity." Quentin pulled out a worn leather notebook from his jacket pocket. "Christopher, your father once asked me to look into questionable transactions, but then the scandal broke, and I never got the chance to finalize my findings. There were hints that certain executives might have been involved in skimming money from the company's expansions." Christopher's eyebrows shot up. "Why didn't he tell me?" Quentin sighed, leaning against the table. He wanted to handle it himself, quietly. He thought maybe it was a misunderstanding or a minor issue. Then that journalist, he paused, catching himself. Well, a journalist exposed alleged wrongdoing by John Gray. Your father never had the chance to clear his name or finish dealing with the matter internally. Hannah's throat went dry. She recalled the scandal from 15 years ago all too well, though she hadn't admitted yet that she was the reporter behind it. The memory weighed on her, but she held her tongue for now. They had a more urgent crisis to handle. She tapped on her laptop, bringing up more detailed spreadsheets. Quentin, maybe you can help verify these numbers. If you see any patterns that confirm your suspicions from back then, it could give us a clearer path to proving the entire scheme. Quentin nodded, taking a seat and leaning in to read the data. Christopher stood behind them, arms folded, scanning each entry. He recognized account names that seemed suspiciously similar, off by a single letter or an extra digit, classic shell company tactics. Minutes turned into an hour as they pored over the evidence. Pages of transactions came alive with glaring anomalies. Occasionally, Hannah pointed to an email snippet or a reference to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. Quentin scratched notes in his little notebook, shaking his head at times. "This is not new," he remarked at one point. "Some of these patterns date back almost 2 decades. Christopher felt a pang in his chest. If John Gray had known, perhaps he'd tried to fix it, but maybe the scandal overshadowed everything. He might never know the full truth of what his father did or didn't do. Finally, Quentin closed the laptop, looking exhausted but resolute. There's enough here to launch a major investigation, federal, if necessary. The question is, do we release this publicly, or do we try to handle it more discreetly first? Christopher ran a hand through his hair, feeling the strain of responsibility. If we go public right away, we risk a meltdown. Stocks crash, people panic. But if we do nothing, we're just giving the conspirators time to cover their tracks. Hannah chewed her lower lip. I might have contacts in Denver, an editor I trust at my publication, and a former prosecutor who sometimes works with whistleblowers. If we can get them involved, we might have a safer route to expose this while safeguarding employees. Time is of the essence, Quentin reminded them. Randall must realize something's wrong. He'll be pulling strings behind the scenes. Christopher's phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID showed Mother. He hesitated, then answered. Mom! Margaret Gray's voice came through, subdued but worried. Chris, dear, are you all right? Randall called me, said he couldn't get in touch with you. He sounded urgent. Heart pounding, Christopher exchanged a glance with Hannah. I'm fine, Mom, he lied gently. I'm just, sorting some issues here in Aspen. Did Randall say anything else? He seemed concerned. Wanted me to ask you to call him immediately about a time-sensitive matter. Chris, I'm worried. Is there something you're not telling me? Closing his eyes, Christopher willed himself to stay calm. There's a lot happening, Mom, but I promise I'll explain soon. For now, just know that I'm safe. Please trust me. Margaret hesitated. I do trust you, son. Just be careful. Call me if you need anything. He ended the call. Looking at the expectant faces around the table, he inhaled slowly. It's begun. Randall is already making moves. We're definitely entering uncharted territory. Hannah closed her laptop, her expression steeling. Then let's not waste any more time. We know what we have to do. With that, the three of them began to draft a plan, trading the ordinary comforts of corporate stability for the uncertain road of exposing corruption. They had stepped fully into a world where illusions shattered, old truths were questioned, and the stakes were more than mere business. They were personal, moral, and possibly life-threatening. The night slipped into early morning while Christopher, Hannah, and Quentin devised their strategy in the quiet meeting room. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed softly, accentuating the weary lines on their faces. Despite the fatigue gnawing at them, they knew they couldn't afford to rest. Each passing minute was a window for the conspirators to pivot or strike back. Quentin spread out a laminated map of the resort on the table. "Here's where the main conference halls connect to the west wing, where your room is," he pointed. "Security patrols typically sweep this area every few hours, but their focus is on keeping guests safe from accidents, not from cunning corporate criminals." Hannah nodded, leaning in to get a better view. "I'll need to step outside at some point to meet with my editor and that former prosecutor I mentioned. We can't rely on hotel Wi-Fi for secure communications. They can be monitored." Christopher glanced at her. "I have a portable hotspot with encryption that Greytech developed for secure teleconferencing. We could try that if you'd trust one of our own devices." A thin smile crossed his lips, half ironic. After all, the corruption they were fighting originated within Greytech itself. Hannah paused. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll use my own phone's secure VPN. It's less traceable. Though if we're in a pinch, I won't say no to your gadget." Across the table, Quentin rubbed his eyes, the notebook open to pages crammed with numbers. "If the data we have is accurate, we're looking at major offenses: tax fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Enough to bring criminal charges against Randall and his cohorts." Christopher's gaze drifted across the room. He remembered how proud he'd been when he officially took over the CEO position at Greytech, hoping to steer the company into a bright, innovative future. Now, it felt like the foundation under his feet was rotting. "You okay?" Hannah asked quietly, noticing his distant expression. He looked up, forcing a small nod. It's a lot to process, but I'm determined we do this right. We might still save Greytech from complete collapse." Quentin straightened. "We'll need to adapt to this environment. That means keeping a low profile. Also, we should confirm the whereabouts of any suspicious board members if they're staying here." Hannah flicked through her phone. "I did see one of the board members, Maxwell Crane, listed as an attendee at the conference. He's known to be close to Randall." "Right," Christopher said, recalling the tall, stern man who rarely smiled but always asked pointed questions at board meetings. "We should assume he might be involved, or at least that he'll support Randall if pressed." They moved on to planning possible meetings with federal authorities. Quentin mentioned a contact he once had at the SEC, though it was years ago. Hannah explained how her editor in Denver could coordinate a discreet approach, ensuring the story broke at the right time, ideally once law enforcement was prepared to act. A knock at the door startled them all. Hannah tensed, shutting her laptop. Christopher exchanged a glance with Quentin, who quietly slipped to the door and peered through the small glass window. A moment later, he nodded at the others to relax. It was only the resort's janitorial staff member, pushing a cart. He opened the door just enough to speak in hushed tones. "Sorry to bother you, sir," said the young man in a navy uniform. "I saw the lights on and thought I should check if you needed anything." "The cleaning schedule showed this room empty." Quentin cleared his throat. "My colleagues and I ended up here to wrap some urgent business. We'll be out soon. Thank you." The staffer offered a polite nod and left. Quentin locked the door again, exhaling. "That was close. We've got to keep an eye out." "Let's find a safer spot to hide the backups," Hannah suggested. "If they raid our rooms again, we could lose everything." Christopher stepped away from the map, pacing. "There's a storage closet down the hall where they keep extra chairs. Maybe we can hide one of the hard drives in a sealed box or something." Hannah considered it. "I'll do that, but let me label it in a way only I can recognize." She rummaged in her bag for a roll of tape and a marker, then wrapped a plain piece of paper around the hard drive. In neat handwriting, she wrote something that looked like a random code, just enough to remember which item was which. Before they stepped out, Christopher took Hannah aside, voice low. "Look, I know we still don't fully trust each other, especially considering the past, But I'm grateful you're being cautious." She nodded, understanding his unspoken tension. "We're in this together now. Neither of us can afford to let the other fail." With that unsteady alliance reaffirmed, they exited the meeting room, scanning the corridor in both directions. This was the next phase of their journey. No longer safe in the normal confines of daily life, they had to navigate the hidden corridors, both literally and metaphorically, of a conspiracy that could ruin them all if left unchallenged. Adapting to each twist and turn was their only chance to survive. Stepping into the corridor, Christopher led the way toward the storage closet he'd mentioned. The overhead lighting flickered in the silent hallway. Everyone walked with hushed footsteps, ears attuned for any sign of approaching figures. Reaching a metal door labeled "Banquet Chairs and Supplies," Christopher used a small master key he'd borrowed earlier from Quentin's stash of resort access tools. Inside, tall stacks of folding chairs loomed in the dimness, and the faint smell of dust tickled their noses. Hannah quietly located a sealed box of linens in the far corner and slipped one of her hard drives inside. She taped it shut, leaving her coded mark on the underside. "If something goes wrong," she whispered, "and they confiscate my laptop or the other drive, we still have a backup." Christopher nodded. "Smart thinking." They backed out of the closet, carefully locking the door behind them. For a moment, the group lingered in the corridor, hearts pounding with the weight of what they were doing. Suddenly, footsteps reverberated from around a corner. Hannah gestured for them to hide, pressing herself flat against the wall. Quentin and Christopher followed suit, ducking behind a stack of banquet tables, leaning upright near the closet. Two voices drifted closer. One was Maxwell Crane's, distinct and steely. "Randall's on edge. He said Christopher's not returning calls, and there's talk of some investigation happening. We need to secure the data before it leaks." The other voice responded in a mutter, "Where is Gray anyway? He's not in his room, and nobody saw him leave the conference officially." Maxwell made a dismissive sound. "I heard he's been spotted with a woman. A reporter," someone said. "That's bad news. If they're rummaging around, it spells disaster for all of us. We need to move quickly." Hannah felt a jolt of alarm. Clearly, word was circulating that she was a journalist, and Maxwell feared exposure. They could be seconds away from stumbling upon Christopher and her. She held her breath, body tense against the cold metal. The footsteps stopped just short of the closet door. For a heart-stopping instant, she wondered if they were about to open it. But instead, Maxwell and his companion turned down another hallway, their conversation fading. Quentin exhaled silently, glancing at Christopher. "They're definitely onto us. We have to assume they'll tear this place apart looking for you and the evidence." Christopher's jaw tightened. "They're not giving me much choice. We either bring this to the authorities immediately or we risk losing everything." Hannah spoke softly. "Before we take that step, let me see if I can contact my editor. She might have resources to keep us safe, especially if we can get a whistleblower case started." They retreated to a quieter section of the convention area, a short corridor lined with vending machines and lounge chairs. There, Hannah pulled out her phone, activating a secure VPN. She typed rapidly, sending an urgent message to her editor in Denver, Linda Atwood. While Hannah was occupied, Quentin turned to Christopher. "I thought your father's final scandal was just rumor and misrepresentation, but maybe, just maybe, he stumbled upon these earlier crimes and tried to address them quietly. If so, the real culprits might have thrown him under the bus to protect themselves." Christopher's shoulders sagged as he recalled John Gray's crestfallen demeanor during those tumultuous final months. "He never told me enough details. I was still in the early stages of my career, just learning the ropes. He probably thought I was too young." Quentin patted Christopher's arm. "You're not that young anymore. You have the power to fix this." Hannah ended her call, sliding the phone back in her pocket. Linda says she'll help, but she wants a secure location to meet. She also knows a retired federal prosecutor who might advise us. If we can get out of here without alerting Maxwell or Randall, we can rendezvous with Linda in Denver. Maybe tomorrow morning. Christopher let out a slow breath. That means we have to get through tonight without being caught. Maybe we can hole up in a different hotel, or even a safe house in town, if that exists. Quentin looked thoughtful. I know a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of Aspen, family run. They might have an extra room or two. It's not luxurious, but it's discreet. Perfect, Hannah said, relief in her tone. We should go there as soon as we can. The longer we stay here, the higher the chance we'll run into Maxwell or his men. Christopher tapped his foot against the tiled floor, mind racing. Leaving means we have to sneak past potential watchers in the lobby. The parking area. Anyone could spot us. Hannah lifted her chin. We'll manage. We have to. Otherwise, Maxwell and Randall might corner us here before we even get the chance to blow this open. At that moment, the hum of a soft alarm rang through the corridor, indicating the top of the hour. The resort's cleaning staff would be rotating shifts. The time felt symbolic, a quiet urgency for them to move on. Allies, Christopher said with a wry smile, in the unlikeliest place, over the unlikeliest crisis. But we have each other at least. Hannah nodded. We do. Quentin's gaze flicked between them, and he gave a firm nod. Then let's get out of here. I'll do my best to guide us through a service exit. With some luck, we'll evade Maxwell's watchers. Then we'll have the night to plan our next steps in safety. The three of them moved out, a makeshift alliance forged by the shared goal of unmasking the truth. Their path was fraught with danger, but sometimes that was the only way to reveal what lay hidden in the dark corners of power. They descended another set of service stairs, hearts pounding with each echoing step. The air was colder here, as if the vents pumped a chill through the resort's hidden arteries. The plan was straightforward. Slip out a side exit near the loading dock, reach the parking lot, and drive away in Christopher's rented SUV. Quentin took the lead, his eyes darting left and right. I used to handle logistics for big events, he whispered. I know how these back routes work. Just stay close. Hannah clutched her backpack, the remaining hard drive tucked safely inside. Christopher followed with tense determination, phone in hand, in case they needed a quick call to security or even 911. They were just yards from the final door when voices erupted from the corridor behind them, sharp, urgent. A pang of dread shot through Hannah's chest. She recognized that particular timbre of authority, the clipped tone of someone used to being obeyed. Spread out! Check every hallway! The voice reverberated, and Christopher froze in place. He glanced back, seeing silhouettes cast against the walls. Quentin hissed, That must be Maxwell's men! Hurry! They rushed toward the exit. A bright red sign marked Loading Dock Authorized Personnel Only glowed in the overhead light. Quentin shoved it open, letting in a blast of cold air mixed with the smell of diesel. The loading dock was a concrete pad sheltered by a metal awning. Parked near the edge were 2 trucks used for delivering linens and kitchen supplies. No one else was in sight. Slipping out, they let the door shut behind them with a clank. Hannah inhaled the crisp night air, feeling momentary relief to be outside the stifling corridors. But the sense of safety was short-lived. From behind one of the delivery trucks stepped a burly figure in a dark suit, phone pressed to his ear. He spotted them instantly, eyes narrowing. Christopher's heart dropped. It was the same man from Hannah's suite earlier that night. Hey! The man barked into his phone. They're out here by the loading dock. Everything happened in a rush. Hannah clutched Christopher's arm, and Quentin took a step forward, trying to block the man's path. The burly figure snapped his phone shut, advanced with a menacing stance. End of the line, he growled. Hand over the files. Christopher swallowed hard, adrenaline surging. Stay away from us. You have no right. The man lunged, grabbing for Hannah's backpack. She twisted away, nearly stumbling on the slippery concrete. Christopher moved on instinct, using his size to shoulder-check the attacker, sending him momentarily off balance. Quentin darted behind the truck, looking for something, anything, that could serve as a deterrent. He grabbed a metal rod used to lock the truck's cargo door and held it up. "Back off!" Undeterred, the attacker lunged again. This time, Hannah slid the backpack under her arm, stepping away from his grasp. Christopher delivered a desperate shove that sent the man skidding against the side of the truck, momentarily winded. They all knew more pursuers could appear any second. "Run!" Christopher shouted, grabbing Hannah's hand. Quentin tossed the metal rod aside and hurried after them as they sprinted across the loading dock. The parking lot lay beyond a high fence with a single gate. Christopher's SUV was parked off to the right, barely visible under faint floodlights. With each step, his heart hammered, the weight of fear pressing on him. He glanced back to see the burly man recovering, fumbling with his phone to call for backup. They reached the fence. Quentin found the latch and yanked it open. The gate creaked, and they slipped through, breath ragged from the dash. Hannah clutched her bag, scanning the lot for more threats. A single guard stood in a booth by the main resort entrance, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the loading area. Christopher pointed to his SUV. "Over there!" They raced across the asphalt, the cold biting at their lungs. Thankfully, no other pursuers seemed to block their path, at least not yet. The SUV's locks beeped as Christopher pressed the key fob, and they piled in, slamming the doors. "Go, go, go!" Hannah urged from the back seat, yanking on her seatbelt. Christopher's hands shook as he started the engine. Headlights cut through the darkness, and the SUV roared to life. He put it in gear, tires squealing as they pulled onto the winding road leading away from the resort. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the burly man bursting out of the loading dock gate, shouting furiously into his phone. They weaved down the steep driveway, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Quentin, in the passenger seat, blew out a sharp breath. "We made it, at least for now." Hannah glanced back, half expecting a caravan of vehicles to appear in pursuit, but all they saw were the distant lights of the Grand Resort behind them. "Let's just hope they don't track us to the B&B, she said, her voice trembling with residual fear. Christopher tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'll take the back roads. We'll find that place, hole up for the night. Then tomorrow we head to Denver." "Agreed," Quentin said, relief and tension mingling in his tone. Hannah nodded, checking the backpack to ensure the hard drive was still safe. "Agreed," she echoed softly. The SUV rolled deeper into the snowy Aspen night, leaving behind the looming silhouette of the resort. In that moment, Christopher felt a flicker of something akin to hope. They'd survived the first real confrontation, tested the resolve of those trying to silence them, yet he also knew the battle was just beginning. With powerful enemies and incriminating evidence in play, the stakes had never been higher. They were in uncharted territory now, together but hunted, and whether they liked it or not, the fate of Greytech and Christopher's own legacy would be decided by the choices they made in the days to come. The SUV's headlights carved two bright tunnels through the dark, winding road outside Aspen. Snowdrifts glimmered in the beams, and pine trees stood like silent sentinels on either side of the pavement. Christopher gripped the wheel, ears still ringing from the commotion at the resort's loading dock. Beside him, Quentin peered at a map on his phone, trying to direct them to the discreet bed and breakfast he remembered from a past business trip. Hannah, in the back seat, clutched her backpack protectively. The rhythmic hum of the car's tires might have lulled her to sleep under other circumstances, but now her heartbeat remained a steady drum of anxiety. She glanced out the rear window every few minutes, wary of any headlights that might signal pursuers. "We should be close," Quentin said, squinting at his phone. "A mile or two down this road, and we'll see a small sign for Aspen Pine Retreat." Christopher exhaled. Let's hope they have a vacancy. If not, we'll be sleeping in this SUV. As if on cue, a wooden sign emerged from the gloom, softly lit by a single lantern. "Aspen Pine Retreat," read the rustic lettering. Christopher turned onto a gravel driveway lined with firs. Eventually, a quaint two-story home materialized, lights glowing behind drawn curtains. The place looked like a serene family house more than a conventional inn. They parked around back, away from the main entrance. Snow crunched underfoot as they stepped out, breath clouding in the cold air. A single lamp above the rear door illuminated a small welcome mat. Quentin knocked quietly, hoping not to disturb other guests at this late hour. After a moment, a woman in her 60s, wrapped in a warm cardigan, answered the door. She had kind eyes that flicked between them with gentle curiosity. "May I help you?" Quentin cleared his throat. "I'm sorry for the late arrival. My name's Quentin Ross. I stayed here last winter. We're in need of a room, or two if possible, just for tonight." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I do recall the name, Mr. Ross. Let me see what I can do." She led them through a cozy kitchen that smelled faintly of baked bread, then into a small office area. While she searched the reservation book, Hannah noticed the flicker of uncertainty on the hostess's face. 3 guests arriving without luggage, at nearly 2 in the morning, must have seemed peculiar. "We have 2 rooms free," the woman said at last, glancing over the rim of her glasses. "They're small, but they'll do. My name is Eloise." She paused, then added gently, "You all look exhausted." Christopher managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Eloise." "This means a lot." Quentin settled the payment, and soon they were guided upstairs. 2 adjacent rooms, each with a simple bed, a wooden dresser, and a view of the snow-covered yard. The walls displayed framed photos of mountain landscapes, adding a comforting touch. Once Eloise had left them to settle in, Christopher and Quentin convened quietly in the hallway with Hannah. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that any other guests might be sleeping behind nearby doors. "We should keep watch in case someone tracks us down," Hannah said, pressing her back against the hallway's floral wallpaper. "I doubt it'll happen tonight, but better safe than sorry." Christopher nodded. "I'll take the first watch. Quentin, you and Hannah rest a bit. In a few hours, we can switch." Quentin looked reluctant, but eventually agreed. "Wake me if you hear even a creak of the floorboards that doesn't belong here." Hannah followed him into one of the rooms, while Christopher took the other. After quietly closing the door, Christopher leaned against it, letting out a trembling sigh. His mind wouldn't settle. The events at the resort played on loop, Maxwell Crane's chilling voice, the burly enforcer's brutal presence, the frantic escape. They'd come too close to losing everything. He pulled out his phone, checking messages. There were missed calls from Randall Fisher and 2 from his mother. Guilt pricked at him, but he resolved to focus on immediate survival. With a heavy heart, he grabbed the chair from the small desk, propped it by the window, and sat so he could see the driveway. Pale moonlight illuminated the quiet property. In the distance, an owl hooted softly, as though mocking the tension that clung to him. Every half hour or so, he stood to stretch, listening intently for any engine sounds or approaching footsteps. The old wooden house groaned occasionally, but no ominous figures appeared. He watched the star-strewn sky shift as the hours crawled by. Slowly, the black horizon began to lighten, suggesting dawn's approach. His thoughts drifted to Greytech. If the entire board was tainted or complicit, he would have to make a public stand. Could he handle the backlash? The stock freefall. Could employees handle the chaos? At the same time, ignoring this conspiracy would be a betrayal of everything he once held dear. The memory of his father's public disgrace weighed heavily on him. Eventually, fatigue blurred his vision. He blinked back weariness, determined to remain alert for Hannah's sake, for them all. One thing was certain. In a few short hours, they would face another day of challenges. And with the rising sun, the clock would continue ticking on whatever fate awaited Greytech and the legacy his father left behind. A pale wash of morning light seeped into the rooms of Aspen Pine Retreat. Christopher woke Quentin just as the sky began to brighten. Moments later, Hannah stirred, rubbing her eyes wearily. She had managed only a few hours of sleep, haunted by the possibility of footsteps outside her door. In the snug dining area downstairs, Eloise greeted them with steaming coffee and a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. The smell was comforting, yet an undercurrent of urgency thrummed between the three of them, unacknowledged but palpable. "You folks passing through?" Eloise asked politely, setting down a pitcher of orange juice. "We don't often get visitors this late in the season unless they're here for skiing." Hannah offered a polite nod. "We're dealing with some work issues." Eloise smiled kindly. "I won't pry. If you need anything, just let me know." Then she discreetly left them to their conversation. Quentin took a sip of coffee and pulled out his battered notebook. "We need to figure out if it's safe to drive to Denver today. That's a few hours away, but Maxwell's men could be watching every major road out of Aspen." Christopher ran a hand over his face. "We could try back roads, but that might add hours to the journey. And once we reach Denver, where exactly do we go?" Hannah cleared her throat, glancing at Christopher. "I spoke to my editor, Linda, last night, just text messages. She's willing to meet us at a secure location in Denver. She also mentioned introducing us to a retired federal prosecutor who's helped with whistleblower cases before. He might guide us on dealing with the authorities." Quentin nodded, flipping through pages covered in careful pen scratches. "We can't just burst into an FBI office unprepared. If Maxwell or Randall get wind of our plan, they'll do everything possible to block or discredit us." Christopher's gaze dropped to the table. The tension in his chest grew heavier with every passing moment. Finally, he exhaled. "Let's do it. We'll move as soon as we can. I'll need to call my mother on the way. She deserves to know something of what's happening. She's worried about me, and I have questions about my father." Hannah looked as though she might speak, then hesitated. She knew she needed to reveal her involvement with John Gray's scandal many years ago, but fear knotted her stomach. Christopher had already suffered so much. Still, she realized it was unfair to keep that secret. Before she could gather the courage, Quentin announced, "I'll sort out the route. Maybe I can download a few offline maps to avoid using typical GPS in case they're tracking cell signals." They finished breakfast hastily. Christopher left some cash on the table for Eloise, quietly thanking her for the hospitality. Outside, the winter morning was cold and bright. They loaded up the SUV, scanning the tree line for any sign of suspicious figures. Nothing stirred but the wind in the branches. As the SUV rumbled to life, Hannah settled into the back seat, her laptop once again on her knees. She had dozed off earlier, but now her mind raced. The question hovered like a spectre. Was it finally time to tell Christopher the truth about her role in exposing John Gray's alleged wrongdoing? They turned onto a narrow country road, the B&B shrinking behind them. Quentin navigated from the passenger seat, directing Christopher onto smaller byways. With each mile, the snow thinned, replaced by rocky terrain and winding passes. Grey clouds blanketed the sky, threatening more snow or perhaps a wintry rain. An hour later, while driving through a sparse stretch of highway, Christopher's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His mother was calling again. He shot a look at Hannah in the rearview mirror, then tapped to answer via speaker. "Mom?" he said, forcing calm into his voice. Margaret Gray's voice quavered slightly. "Chris, thank goodness. Randall keeps calling me, demanding I pass on messages to you. He says there's a critical board meeting today. Are you in trouble?" Christopher exchanged a look with Quentin, who nodded for him to proceed. "Mum, Please tell Randall I'm tied up. I'll address the board soon, but there are bigger issues at stake. Chris, I'm worried about you. Randall implied something about wrongdoing at Greytech. He said you've been misled by a reporter, someone trying to destroy the company. Is that true? A pang of guilt shot through Hannah as she listened to Margaret's trembling tone. She could imagine the older woman's alarm, caught between loyalty to her late husband's company and concern for her son. Christopher hesitated. Mom, just trust me. We've uncovered serious corruption. It's not me being misled, it's real. I can't talk now, but I promise I'll explain. Margaret exhaled, sounding near tears. Your father would want you to protect Greytech, Christopher. He built that company, and I will, Christopher interjected gently, but not by hiding the truth. I have to go. Mom, stay safe. Don't talk to Randall any more than you have to. He ended the call, shoulders slumping as the weight of it pressed harder. The SUV's cabin fell silent, the only sound the steady hum of the engine. At last, Hannah gathered her courage and spoke. Voice soft. Christopher, about your father. I have something I need to tell you before this all goes any further. He caught her gaze in the rearview mirror, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. What is it? Hannah's heart pounded. She swallowed hard. It's about the scandal 15 years ago, the article that contributed to his downfall. That reporter was me. A heavy pause filled the SUV, tension building like a storm about to break. Quentin stared down at the map, wisely staying silent. Christopher kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the wheel tightened, whitening his knuckles. Outside, the sky shifted ominously, mirroring the turmoil within. Hannah braced herself, knowing she had just cast an even darker shadow across their journey, one that might change everything. Silence gripped the SUV like a vice. Hannah could almost hear Christopher's heartbeat hammering in time with her own. She saw his jaw clench, and a tremor coursed through his shoulders. They barreled down the empty highway, mountains looming on either side, the storm clouds gathering ominously above. Finally, Christopher broke the quiet, voice strained. You're telling me you're the reporter who wrote those stories, accusing my father of wrongdoing, tarnishing his reputation until he died? Hannah drew a trembling breath. Yes, she whispered. I was young, ambitious, desperate for a big scoop. I believed the sources who said your father was involved in shady financial deals. When the scandal exploded, it may have contributed to his heart attack. I've carried that guilt for years. A sharp exhalation rattled from Christopher. You destroyed him, he said, almost inaudibly. He always claimed innocence. I believed him. You turned him into a pariah right before my eyes. In the front passenger seat, Quentin remained quiet, sensing this was a deeply personal confrontation. He stared at the passing scenery, letting them work through the painful truth in their own time. Hannah twisted her hands in her lap. I don't expect forgiveness, she murmured. I only wanted you to know the truth. If we're going to expose Randall and the others, I can't keep lying by omission. Christopher swallowed hard, eyes trained on the winding road. Emotions warred within him. Anger, betrayal, an echo of the grief he'd never fully processed. You wrote those articles, he repeated, but did you know they weren't entirely accurate? That my father might have been on the trail of the same corruption we're facing now. Her eyes welled with tears. I didn't know. Not then. I had partial documents. Leads that pointed to the possibility your father was signing off on fraudulent accounts. Maybe he was framed or manipulated, but I didn't see that side. I reported what I had, trusting my editors, and we went to press. A low growl of thunder punctuated her words, as if the storm itself bore witness to the confession. The SUV rocked slightly with a gust of wind. For a moment, Christopher considered pulling over, but he pressed on, knuckles taut around the steering wheel. He forced himself to inhale slowly. So, all this time, you've been investigating more wrongdoing at Greytech, the same place my father built. Are you trying to redeem yourself, or is it just another story for you? Hannah closed her eyes, letting the question cut deep. It's more than a story, she answered quietly. I started this investigation like any other assignment, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized something was off years ago. Now, seeing everything these conspirators have done, and meeting you, I want to make it right. Not just for John Gray's memory, but for everyone who might be victimized by this corruption. His jaw stayed rigid, but he gave a slight nod, though it was unclear whether it was acceptance or merely acknowledgement. Tension crackled in the air like static before a downpour. Another mile passed in silence. Finally, Christopher cleared his throat. Thank you for telling me. I need time to process. But for now, we have a common goal, exposing Randall and saving Greytech from these criminals. Let's focus on that. Relief washed over Hannah, though her chest still felt tight with the pain of old regrets. Of course, she said softly. I'm here to help. Quentin glanced at Christopher. We should pull over soon. There's a small rest area about 5 miles ahead. This storm looks like it's about to hit hard. We can decide whether to press on or wait it out. Christopher nodded, tension still radiating from him. He turned on the wipers as fat droplets of rain and a bit of sleet spattered against the windshield. The swirling clouds above seemed to mirror the emotional tempest inside the SUV. When they arrived at the rest area, it was nearly empty. A battered pickup truck stood near one corner. Otherwise, the place was deserted. Christopher parked, and the three stepped out under the metal awning beside a vending machine. The wind stung their faces with icy gusts. Quentin scanned the horizon. This storm might slow us down, but staying put too long invites the risk of being tracked. We can't be sure Maxwell doesn't have resources scanning the roads for your license plate. Christopher grunted in agreement. Hannah rubbed her arms, feeling the chill through her jacket. She approached Christopher cautiously, noticing how he avoided her gaze. She drew a careful breath. Look, I'm sorry. Truly, I know saying it doesn't fix what happened to your father, but I hope you believe me when I say I'm not that reckless journalist anymore. He didn't speak for a moment, his eyes on the sky where swirling clouds threatened to unleash more sleet. Finally, he nodded once, though his gaze remained distant. I hear you. Let's just get through this. The wind rattled the awning, and thunder boomed in the distance. With jaws set and hearts burdened, they hurried back into the SUV, determined to outrun both the storm and the ghosts of their past. 2 more hours of careful driving carried them down winding mountain roads slick with wintry mix. Christopher navigated slowly, sometimes forced to stop altogether as visibility dropped. Every now and then, they'd catch fleeting cell service, letting Hannah send updates to her editor, Linda. Each time, Linda replied with cautious support, urging them to reach Denver safely. By the time the storm began to lighten, the rugged peaks of the Rockies gave way to gentler foothills. Christopher's jaw relaxed marginally as the roads improved. He cast a quick glance at the back seat, where Hannah scrolled through her phone. Despite the tension, she looked resolved, as though nothing could deter her from this mission now. Eventually, they reached a small gas station on the outskirts of a rural community. The place had a single pump and a cramped convenience store. Quentin suggested they stop to fill up, grab some provisions, and stretch their legs. Christopher parked near a dormant air hose station, stepping outside into a brisk wind. While Quentin handled the pump, Hannah and Christopher drifted toward the store's entrance. Silence draped them, weighted by the recent revelation of her past involvement with John Gray's downfall. Yet a mutual understanding seemed to linger beneath that tension. They were stuck in this together. Inside, the store's fluorescent lighting revealed shelves lined with snacks, bottled water, and souvenirs for passing travelers. A radio played softly in the background, the local DJ chatting about an approaching cold front. Hannah picked up a bottle of water and glanced at Christopher. "I can't help but wonder if Randall has put out an alert on our descriptions. We should avoid showing our faces too much." Christopher nodded grimly. "We'll make it quick. Grab what we need and go." She paused, eyes scanning the handful of patrons, a trucker picking up coffee, a young couple in ski gear. Nobody seemed to pay them any mind. As she waited to pay at the counter, Hannah heard a ping on her phone. It was a message from Linda. "Need you to confirm arrival time frame. Ex-prosecutor meeting us. We're undisclosed LOC. Keep me posted. Stay safe." Hannah typed back quickly. "Close to Denver. Weather slowed us. We'll confirm ETA soon." At the checkout, Christopher added a couple of energy bars and paid in cash. He nodded politely to the cashier, but his gaze remained watchful, scanning the windows for any suspicious faces. They stepped outside to find Quentin by the SUV, the gas pump clicking off. The old nozzle handle squeaked as he replaced it. "Let's go," Christopher murmured, unlocking the doors. "We'll try to be in Denver in under 2 hours." The trio piled back in. As they pulled away, Hannah exhaled, feeling a thin sense of relief. So far, no sign of Maxwell's men. Still, the memory of their last close call at the loading dock kept adrenaline pulsing in her veins. The drive resumed, the road stretching ahead in a mix of farmland and low hills. At times, Christopher kept his foot steady on the gas, seemingly lost in thought. Hannah recognized the subtle shift in his demeanor. He was calmer than before, but a storm brewed behind his eyes. Perhaps he was working through decades of pain, reconciling his father's alleged innocence with the possibility that John Gray might have unwittingly been part of a corrupt system. Eventually, Hannah spoke quietly. "What do you think you'll do once we have the authorities on our side? About the board, the future of Gray Tech?" Christopher sighed. "It'll be a mess, no doubt. We'll have to remove the guilty parties and restructure the leadership. The PR fallout alone could cripple us. But better to face it now than let the disease spread if it destroys the company. Well, at least we tried to save the employees from worse betrayal down the line." Quentin chimed in from the passenger seat. "You might be surprised. Sometimes, when a company's leader does the right thing, publicly, transparently, stockholders regain trust. As long as you show genuine intent to fix the rot." A faint glimmer of hope kindled in Christopher's eyes. "I'd like to believe that." They pressed on, miles ticking by. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Denver's skyline appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of buildings set against a backdrop of mountains. Hannah shot a text to Linda, letting her know they were within city limits. "Fragile victory," Quentin murmured, flipping his notebook closed. "We've made it here, but we still have to navigate the next steps carefully." Hannah's stomach twisted with a mix of nerves and anticipation. They had physical evidence, a growing team of supporters, and Christopher's willingness to face the board. It felt like a tentative win, yet the true battle lay just ahead. Public exposure, potential legal retaliation, and the final unmasking of those who sought to profit from Graytech's downfall. As the SUV merged onto a busy highway leading into downtown, Hannah gazed at Christopher. He caught her eye in the mirror, his expression tinged with both acknowledgement and a lingering hurt. Despite the pain between them, she sensed they might be forging a new kind of trust, one tempered by honesty, even if it had come far too late. Soon, they would meet Linda and the ex-prosecutor, forging the next step in their campaign to blow open the conspiracy. But at least for this moment, they had made it to the threshold of Denver, a fragile victory indeed. They reached a quiet neighborhood in southwest Denver, following Linda's instructions to meet at a small boutique hotel with a plain brick exterior and a discreet side entrance. The street was lined with mid-century homes, tall trees bare in the winter chill, their branches casting spidery shadows in the dusky light. After parking the SUV in a side lot, Christopher, Hannah and Quentin walked toward the hotel's side door. Hannah's heart pounded. This meeting would set the course for their next, and perhaps most dangerous, move. If Linda's contact, the retired federal prosecutor, deemed their evidence valid, they would file official complaints with the authorities. The risk of retaliation was huge. Inside, the lobby smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish. Linda Atwood stood up from a low couch near the windows, her short, dark hair framing a serious expression. Late 40s, she carried herself with the air of a seasoned editor, direct and measured. Next to her was a man in his early 60s, tall and lean, with grey hair neatly parted. He wore a navy sports jacket and exuded a quiet confidence. Hannah rushed forward. "Linda, thank you for coming." She spared a glance at the man. "This is Christopher Gray, CEO of Graytech, and Quentin Ross, a longtime associate of the Gray family. Everyone, this is Linda Atwood, my editor, and Paul Renfield, a retired federal prosecutor." Hands were shaken, polite greetings exchanged. Paul gestured toward a small conference room just off the lobby. "We can talk privately in here," he said in a deep, even tone. Once inside, they drew the blinds. Linda placed her laptop on a round table, eyeing Hannah with a mixture of concern and respect. "You've really stirred up a hornet's nest this time, Hannah. I've been getting calls from random numbers, anonymous tips about corporate malfeasance, some folks warning me to drop the story." Christopher stiffened. "They're trying to intimidate you, same as us. This conspiracy runs deeper than we thought." Paul sat down, leaning forward with hands clasped. "Show me what you have," he said calmly. Hannah launched into a concise overview of their findings: the shell companies, offshore accounts, and suspicious email chains implicating high-level Graytech executives. Quentin added details from his old auditing notes, painting a picture of systematic fraud. Christopher chimed in with references to Randall Fisher's recent maneuvers and Maxwell Crane's sinister involvement. When they finished, Paul Renfield pressed his fingertips together, reflecting, "This is substantial evidence. The key will be verifying authenticity and establishing a clear chain of custody. We'll need forensic analysis on those emails and transaction records. Once that's done, I'd advise reaching out to the appropriate federal agencies, likely the SEC and the IRS, possibly the FBI if wire fraud or racketeering is suspected." Linda flipped through some printed documents Hannah handed over, her brows knitting. "We have to handle the media angle with caution. If we publish too soon, Maxwell's people could shift blame or destroy records. If we delay, they might track down Hannah or Christopher and sabotage everything." Christopher inhaled slowly, gaze fixed on the table. "I can't ignore the board of directors either. They're expecting me at Graytech's headquarters soon. If Maxwell or Randall suspect I'm about to blow this wide open, they'll close ranks and possibly use dirty tactics to protect themselves." Quentin tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "We also worry about employees. A scandal could tank stock prices, leading to layoffs or panic. We'd like to minimize collateral damage." Paul studied them with a measured calm. "We can approach the authorities discreetly first, giving them time to secure evidence and freeze certain accounts. Then, if Hannah's publication coordinates with Linda, you release the story once the legal framework is set. That way, Graytech has a chance to recover under new leadership. Yours, presumably, Mr. Gray, after the crooked elements are removed." Christopher's jaw tightened. "I want to see Graytech survive. My father's memory deserves that much. But I won't shield criminals. This is a line I have to cross." Hannah met his gaze, silently acknowledging how much he'd changed since the night they first collided in that hotel suite. Their alliance, tempered by revelations, regrets, and moral courage, now stood at the precipice of real action. Linda clicked her pen. In practical terms, we'll need to move fast. Maxwell and Randall won't sit idle. There's also the risk that if you show up at Greytech headquarters, they could ambush you physically or with lawsuits, or spin the narrative that you're staging a hostile takeover. That's where I come in, Paul said. I can guide you through protective measures, court injunctions, protective custody if needed, though that's extreme. The key is we can't hesitate. Christopher took a moment to steady his breathing. We should finalize our plan tonight. In the morning, we move. Hannah, can you coordinate with Linda on the article? Quentin and I can prepare everything for the legal side with Paul. A sense of unity settled over them, though it was edged with uncertainty. Each recognized they were at the brink, a storm poised to break. When it did, their lives and reputations would be on the line. As they gathered their documents and made final arrangements, Hannah noticed Christopher pause, eyes distant. Gently, she placed a hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" He nodded, face drawn but resolute. "I'm just realizing, once we take this step, there's no return to the life I knew. But maybe that's all right. Maybe it's time." Beyond the drawn blinds, the last glimmers of daylight faded into a grey winter dusk. Tomorrow would bring confrontation with Randall, Maxwell, and the full force of Greytech's hidden corruption. They stood at the edge of the storm, bound by a shared commitment to truth, no matter the cost. The night sky over Denver was clear and cold as Christopher stepped away from the conference room in the small boutique hotel. The quiet hallway felt oddly peaceful, starkly contrasting the turmoil in his mind. He had just finalized plans with Hannah, Quentin, Linda, and Paul Renfield for what promised to be the riskiest move of his career, confronting the board of Greytech while simultaneously delivering evidence to federal authorities. Hannah came up beside him, her warm coat folded over one arm. She was visibly weary, dark circles under her eyes, yet her posture exuded unwavering determination. "I just coordinated with Linda. She's pulling an all-nighter drafting the preliminary article. Paul's making calls to the SEC contact he trusts, ensuring we can file the complaint first thing in the morning." Christopher nodded, absently rubbing the back of his neck. "They'll try everything to discredit us. Randall might even spin the board into thinking we're staging a coup or forging documents." Hannah's gaze flicked over his face, concern mingled with empathy. "I know you didn't sign up for any of this, but if we don't act now, they'll bury the truth." He inhaled deeply, recalling the swirl of data, the shell companies, bribes, and stolen funds. "Yes, we have to see this through." Together, they returned to the makeshift war room they'd set up, a modest suite furnished with a long table, a few chairs, and a row of laptops. Quentin was hunched over one of them, cross-referencing account numbers. Linda typed rapidly on her computer, occasionally stopping to sip lukewarm coffee. Paul Renfield paced in front of a window that overlooked the quiet street, phone pressed to his ear. When Christopher entered, Quentin looked up. "I've confirmed more direct links between Maxwell Crane and those offshore entities. Once we present these findings to the authorities, they can freeze the relevant accounts." Paul ended his call, addressing everyone. "We've got a small window. I've arranged for 2 investigators from the IRS and 1 from the SEC to meet us at a federal building on the east side of town tomorrow at 9 sharp. Linda turned her laptop around so they could see the draft headline on the local news site. "Major tech firm faces allegations of large-scale financial fraud." Beneath it was a sub-headline. "Insider evidence emerges. Names high-level executives." Hannah flinched slightly. She understood the power of words all too well, having once ignited a scandal that affected Christopher's father. But this time, the headline felt more like justice than sensationalism. Paul cleared his throat. "We'll hand over the documentation to the authorities. Then Linda will have the go-ahead to publish. Ideally, We want to synchronize both so the conspirators can't run. Christopher crossed his arms. And what about the board meeting? Randall insisted it's critical. If I skip it, they'll claim I'm abdicating my responsibilities. If I show up, they might corner me. A moment of thoughtful silence settled until Quentin quietly said, "You could go, but not alone. If we inform the investigators about the time and location, they could be ready to move in. At the very least, having them on standby would limit how brazen Randall and Maxwell can be." Paul added, "I can't promise they'll arrest anyone on the spot, but your presence might provoke confessions or destructive behavior from the guilty parties. Sometimes suspects incriminate themselves if they think they're on the winning side." Christopher glanced at Hannah, who offered a small, supportive nod. "This is your company, your legacy, your decision," she said softly. A swirl of conflicting emotions filled him: anger at Randall's betrayal, heartbreak over his father's tarnished memory, fear of the chaos that could follow. But beneath it all was a quiet resolve. "I'm going," he stated, voice firm. "If I'm going to reclaim Grey Tech from these criminals, I need to face them head-on." Linda stepped forward, her expression grave. "Then we coordinate carefully. Hannah and I will handle the media side. Paul and Quentin will finalize the legal package. Christopher, you'll walk into that board meeting tomorrow morning, prepared for a showdown. We'll keep in constant communication." The plan laid out, they dispersed to catch a few hours of fitful sleep. Hannah lingered in the sweet small kitchenette, rummaging for tea. She found Christopher there, gazing pensively out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding in one of its anonymous hotel rooms. She spoke gently. "You okay?" He turned, a wry half-smile tugging at his lips. "I will be. I can't lie. Part of me wants to run, find a quiet corner of the world where none of this matters. But this is bigger than me." Hannah reached for his hand, hesitating only slightly. "We'll do it together." He squeezed her hand in response, a momentary flicker of unity. Then, quietly, they separated. Tomorrow beckoned, a day that promised confrontation, exposure, and perhaps liberation from secrets too long concealed. Sleep was scarce that night, as each of them wrestled with visions of what morning would bring. Like a gathering storm, the tension built, promising thunderous consequences. They could only hope their resolve was strong enough to weather it. Dawn broke pale and thin over the Denver skyline. The group convened in the hotel lobby, the air electric with apprehension. Paul Renfield had a leather briefcase bursting with documents and digital backups. Linda slung a large tote over her shoulder, prepared for any media contingency. Hannah carried her laptop containing the final article draft and additional evidence. Quentin, looking more tired than ever, clutched the battered notebook that had guided him this far. Christopher adjusted the collar of his charcoal grey suit, a faint reflection of John Gray's impeccable sense of style. Inside, he felt far from calm, but the suit reminded him of his father's words. "Integrity is the soul of any enterprise." He drew a steadying breath. "We have about 30 minutes before the board meeting," he said, checking his watch. "Let's do this." They split into two vehicles. Christopher and Quentin headed toward Grey Tech's downtown headquarters, while Hannah, Linda, and Paul drove to the federal building for their scheduled meeting with the investigators. The plan was for Paul to hand off the primary evidence package, ensuring an official investigation commenced at the same time. Christopher confronted Randall and Maxwell. The streets around Grey Tech's tower bustled with morning commuters. As Christopher pulled into the underground parking garage, his pulse kicked up. It was surreal to think that he'd parked in this very spot countless times, yet never under such dire circumstances. Quentin broke the tense silence. "When you get upstairs, Stay composed. Let them incriminate themselves. Don't show all your cards until the authorities confirm they have enough to move. Christopher nodded, swallowing against a dry throat. Understood. If you see me stalling or trying to draw them out, follow my lead. They rode the elevator in silence. On the 28th floor, the glass-walled boardroom gleamed with polished wood and panoramic city views. Normally, Christopher found this space inspiring, a symbol of progress. Today, it felt more like a gladiatorial arena. He pushed open the tall double doors. Inside sat the usual cast, a dozen board members, some neutral, some sympathetic, and some deeply suspicious. Maxwell Crane stood at the far end of the table, posture rigid, while Randall Fisher paced with his hands folded behind his back. "Christopher," Randall said, feigning relief. "Thank goodness you could make it. We've had pressing concerns. We thought you'd gone rogue." Maxwell's eyes flashed. "We heard rumors you've been consorting with a journalist bent on bringing down Grey Tech. Care to explain?" Christopher forced a calm smile. "Rumors, Maxwell? Because I've been busy securing the future of this company, that's all." A few board members exchanged puzzled glances. Quentin took a seat near the back, quietly setting his notebook on the table. He offered Christopher a slight nod. Randall moved closer, voice lowered. "We need to finalize the merger deal immediately, or the entire arrangement could collapse. I'm sure you understand the gravity of this." Christopher met Randall's gaze. "Gravity indeed. But I have serious questions about certain financial irregularities, offshore accounts, shell corporations. I want the board to address them before any merger is approved." A ripple of tension shot through the room. Maxwell's jaw tightened visibly. "Are you accusing us of impropriety? Because if so, you'd better have proof." His voice was clipped, a barely veiled threat. Taking a seat at the head of the table, Christopher deliberately rested his hands on the polished surface, fingers interlaced. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically yet, but I have enough evidence to suspect large-scale financial crimes within Grey Tech, and I've provided that evidence to external experts for verification." A hush settled. Several board members looked genuinely startled. Randall's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. Grey Tech is a respected institution. We operate within the law. If there are suspicious documents, they're forged or taken out of context." Christopher glanced at Quentin, who subtly opened his notebook, flipping to a page that detailed the earliest anomalies. "Let's consider the last quarter's financial statements. The numbers differ from internal records we obtained. Care to explain why, Randall?" Randall's facade cracked for a split second, eyes darting to Maxwell. Then he cleared his throat. "A simple accounting oversight. We were going to address it this week. This is not the place to discuss it in front of the entire board." Maxwell stiffened, jumping to Randall's defense. "Precisely. We should convene an internal audit quietly. Dragging this out in public is reckless. Besides, Christopher, you've been AWOL, running off with unscrupulous reporters. You're putting the company at risk." Christopher's voice steadied, cold resolve gleaming in his eyes. "What really puts the company at risk is your deception. I've been investigating you, Maxwell, and you too, Randall. I know about the diverted funds, so do the authorities." A surge of murmurs swept through the boardroom, confusion and fear swirling. Randall's hand clenched into a fist. "I won't stand for these baseless allegations." Christopher leaned forward, heart pounding. "They're far from baseless. And by now, the investigators will have everything they need to see justice done." The tension in the boardroom was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Maxwell Crane's nostrils flared, and he cast a quick glance toward one of the more sympathetic board members, a wiry man named Kenneth Murdoch. Kenneth looked uneasy but hadn't spoken yet. Randall Fisher, meanwhile, seemed to be calculating his next move with every passing second. Christopher felt the adrenaline surge in his veins. This was the confrontation he dreaded and prepared for in equal measure. Clearing his throat, he forced his voice into a measured calm. "Several board members here have no idea what you've been up to, Maxwell. That's why I want to lay it all out. No more secrets, no more rumors." One of the senior board members, Gloria Thompson, a calm presence with sharp insight, spoke up. "Christopher, if you have specific evidence, the board should see it. Are we in danger?" Randall let out a harsh laugh. "Danger? No, this is a misunderstanding. As CFO, I can assure you that any irregularities stem from legitimate business dealings. Christopher's personal vendetta is clouding his judgment. He's trying to sabotage our merger." Christopher gripped the table's edge. "My judgment has never been clearer. I know about the coded transactions, the fraudulent offshore accounts. They lead back to you and Maxwell, along with a handful of others." He slid a few printed pages across the table. Data Quentin had helped compile. A small sample. Maxwell's face darkened as he skimmed the documents, while several board members craned their necks to see. A ripple of alarm spread through the room. "This is private correspondence," Maxwell snapped, eyes blazing at Christopher. "Stolen from Greytech's secure servers. You violated confidentiality." Gloria reached out to examine the papers, frowning at the numbers and names. "This is serious. If these emails are authentic, we could be looking at criminal charges." Kenneth Murdoch finally found his voice, but it shook with uncertainty. "We should call an immediate recess and bring in an external auditor to verify." Randall slammed his palm on the table. "This is absurd. We don't need a recess. We need to expose Christopher for the liar he is. That evidence must be fabricated. He's the one who disappeared for days on end, consorting with suspicious journalists." Christopher caught a tremor in his own chest, a swirl of hurt and fury. "Is it fabricated, Randall, or are you just desperate to hide the truth?" At that moment, the double doors swung open. A uniformed security guard stepped in, looking flustered. "Mr. Gray," Maxwell cut him off. "About time. Escort Mr. Gray and his associate out of here. They're trespassing on a private board meeting." But the guard hesitated, gaze flicking uneasily from Maxwell to Christopher. "Sir, there are federal agents downstairs. They say they need to speak with some of you immediately." A stunned hush fell over the boardroom. Christopher's heart pounded in relief that Paul Renfield and the authorities might be making their move sooner than expected. Perhaps they'd gone directly to Greytech's offices to secure evidence. He saw a flicker of panic in Randall's eyes. Maxwell recovered quickly, adopting a controlling tone. "Tell them we'll cooperate, but they need to wait until our meeting is finished." The guard shook his head firmly. "They insisted it can't wait." At that, Randall Fisher's eyes narrowed. "This is a setup," he muttered. Then, in a sudden, frantic motion, he reached into his jacket pocket. Christopher's pulse spiked. Was Randall about to pull a weapon? Instead, Randall whipped out his phone, jabbing the screen. "I'll call my attorney," he announced. "We're not answering a single question without legal counsel." Yet the desperation in his voice was undeniable. Christopher stood, motioning the security guard aside. "Please, show the agents in if they're waiting. We have nothing to hide." He cast a pointed glance at Maxwell and Randall, whose faces betrayed fear. Within moments, the security guard returned with two suited individuals wearing federal badges. Behind them trailed Paul Renfield, exuding calm authority. The lead agent, a woman with cropped dark hair, introduced herself as Special Agent Veronica Mills of the FBI, though the SEC was also involved. She held up a badge and scanned the room. "We need to speak with Randall Fisher and Maxwell Crane regarding allegations of fraud. We're also here to secure certain Greytech records." Randall sputtered, eyes darting from Maxwell to the board members, to Christopher, and back again. "You can't just barge in here." "We have rights." Veronica Mills raised an eyebrow. "And you'll be afforded every right, Mr. Fisher. But right now, we need to ask you some questions. We also have a warrant to collect digital and paper files." Maxwell Crane's composure cracked. He turned on Christopher, voice trembling with rage. "You orchestrated this! You're going to destroy everything your father built!" Christopher swallowed. "No, Maxwell. You did that yourself by using my father's legacy as a smokescreen for your crimes." Randall glanced toward the door, as if contemplating escape. But two more agents stepped in, blocking the exit. Silence gripped the room. Paul Renfield gave Christopher a small nod from behind the agents, an unspoken acknowledgement that the plan was unfolding as intended. While not everyone might be immediately led away in handcuffs, the wheels of justice had begun to turn. Board members exchanged worried glances. Some looked aghast at Randall and Maxwell. A few stared at Christopher with a mixture of confusion and tentative admiration. He realized that from their perspective, he had just risked the entire company's reputation. Yet truth, he reminded himself, was the only path forward. Randall, sweating profusely, insisted on calling his lawyer while Maxwell's face drained of color. The tension that lingered in the boardroom was like static electricity, ready to erupt at the slightest spark. Christopher took a slow, steady breath. His heart hammered in his ears, but a sense of resolution stole over him. This was the moment John Gray's company began its reckoning, and while the cost would be high, it was a price Christopher was willing to pay. Over the next few hours, the Gray Tech offices descended into controlled chaos. A handful of agents, along with a small team from the SEC, scattered throughout the building, securing files, cloning hard drives, and interviewing staff who might have knowledge of suspicious transactions. Whispered conversations passed between stunned employees in the hallways. The news that top executives were under investigation spread like wildfire. Christopher stood near the reception area, giving instructions to a cluster of wide-eyed mid-level managers. "Stay calm. We're cooperating fully with the authorities. Continue normal operations as best you can." Quentin hovered close by, occasionally stepping aside to direct agents toward relevant financial records. The lines on his face betrayed relief, tinged with exhaustion. "We actually did it," he murmured to Christopher. "We brought the evidence straight to them." Christopher offered a tight smile, though his stomach still twisted with anxiety. "There's no guarantee how this will play out, but at least we're taking action." From down the corridor, Special Agent Mills approached, her badge swinging on a lanyard. "Mr. Gray, we've detained Mr. Fisher and Mr. Crane for questioning. Two of your board members have voluntarily given statements that corroborate some of the allegations." Christopher felt a surge of cautious hope. "Thank you, Agent Mills." She nodded, then cleared her throat. "This investigation will expand. We may need you to testify before a grand jury if charges are brought forward." He swallowed. "I understand." With that, she turned away, resuming her methodical task of dismantling the conspirators' defenses. Christopher exhaled, glancing at Quentin. "It's surreal to watch this happen in my own company." Quentin studied him. "Maybe it's exactly what John Gray wanted years ago, but never got the chance to finalize." Just then, Hannah emerged from an elevator, accompanied by Linda Atwood. They'd hurried from their meeting at the federal building after learning that the agents were already on site. Linda wore a determined expression, phone in hand, her journalist's instincts in full swing. Hannah's eyes darted around, absorbing the sight of government officials in suits interviewing Gray Tech employees. She stepped up to Christopher. "They're being thorough, from what Paul said. We heard Randall and Maxwell might be in separate conference rooms, each trying to shift blame onto the other." Christopher pursed his lips. They'd throw each other under the bus if it means avoiding prison time. Linda glanced at her phone, tapping out a text. We're holding back the full article until we get the go-ahead, but we can post an update, something factual and limited, about an ongoing federal investigation at Greytech. Hannah nodded, biting her lip. I think that's wise. Let's wait for a final confirmation so we don't compromise the agent's work. As Linda moved off to make a call, Hannah turned to Christopher, voice lowered. How are you holding up? He managed a small, grateful smile. It feels like I'm walking a tightrope without a net, but I'm relieved we're finally confronting the truth. And I wanted to say thank you. None of this would be happening without your investigation. Her cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze. Thank you for trusting me, despite everything. They held each other's eyes for a quiet moment, the tension of their shared past simmering but not overwhelming the respect they'd found. Then from the corner of his eye, Christopher noticed Margaret Gray step off the elevator, looking frail yet resolute. She wore a dark coat over her shoulders, her hair carefully styled. "Mom?" he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Margaret's expression was anxious, but she squared her shoulders. "I heard about the agents, the accusations. Randall kept calling me, acting like you'd lost your mind. So I came to see for myself." Christopher guided her away from the busiest area, finding a quiet alcove near a row of potted plants. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." She glanced around at the flurry of activity, agents crossing back and forth, boxes of files being wheeled out. "Are we really in that much trouble?" He hesitated before replying, "Yes and no. There is extensive fraud, but it's not the entire company, just a group of corrupt executives. We're exposing them now, to save Greytech from a worse fate later." Margaret let out a trembling sigh. "Your father would be proud of you for standing up for what's right." Emotions welled in Christopher's chest. "I hope so. I never wanted a scandal. But ignoring what Randall did would be wrong. We might lose money, we might face lawsuits. But at least we'll have our integrity." Tears glistened in Margaret's eyes. "I feared this might destroy you. But I see now. It might free you from the past, from the guilt you've carried about your father." Hannah and Quentin approached, giving Margaret gentle smiles. Hannah, her voice soft, said, "Mrs. Gray, I'm Hannah Sullivan. I'm truly sorry for any pain I contributed to years ago and now." She paused, breath unsteady. "I hope this ends with justice for John Gray's legacy." Margaret assessed Hannah with a wary gaze, but then gave a small, dignified nod. "I appreciate you helping my son see the truth." At that moment, Linda beckoned them over. "The lead agent's about to give a preliminary statement for the official record. She's allowing me to observe, though not to film. Let's gather." They joined the group of staff members and officials in the main lobby, tension thick in the air. Christopher inhaled slowly, recalling every step that led him here, the wrong door at the resort, Hannah's unconscious figure, the stolen documents. Now, in the place he'd once thought of as a beacon of his father's achievements, he stood ready to see them all vindicated or left to pick up the shattered pieces. And yet, despite the chaos, Christopher felt a surge of unwavering resolve. He might lose fortunes, face blame from those who refused to believe the truth, but no matter the outcome, he'd taken a stand. The wide glass doors of Greytech's lobby swung open, letting in a draft of cold air along with a fresh cluster of agents. Cameras from a couple of local news reporters hovered outside. Word had spread fast. Security guards did their best to keep onlookers at bay, but tension buzzed through the crowd. Christopher, Hannah, Quentin, Linda, and Margaret stood near a marble pillar, watching as Special Agent Mills conferred with colleagues in hushed tones. When she finished, she strode purposefully over to Christopher. We've collected enough preliminary evidence to suspect Randall Fisher and Maxwell Crane of multiple felonies, Mills stated quietly. We've also identified at least 2 other board members who may face charges. We'll continue to investigate any leads tying them to offshore accounts. A surge of relief and sorrow mingled in Christopher's chest. What happens next? We'll keep them in custody for formal questioning. They're entitled to legal representation. Meanwhile, we'll freeze critical assets to prevent further loss. Eventually, this will go before prosecutors, possibly a grand jury. If indicted, they'll stand trial. Her gaze softened. You may need to testify? Christopher nodded, glancing at his mother. We're ready. Agent Mills gave a curt nod and stepped away. Nearby, Linda was on the phone to her editors, presumably finalizing the article. Hannah stood at Christopher's shoulder, her presence a silent reassurance. Margaret Gray pressed a hand to her son's arm. Your father's reputation was never fully cleared in the public eye, she said softly. But maybe this will show the world he wasn't the mastermind of wrongdoing here. Christopher's breath caught. I'm sorry I couldn't protect him back then. He died believing the world saw him as a criminal. Margaret's voice wavered. He died proud of you, Chris. That much I know. A wave of emotion threatened to spill over, but Christopher steadied himself. Across the lobby, Maxwell Crane was led away in handcuffs by 2 agents, his face pale and defeated. Randall Fisher followed shortly after, hands restrained, fury radiating in every tense muscle, his eyes locked on Christopher for a brief, venomous moment. Then he was gone, hustled through the doors and into a waiting vehicle. A swirl of press outside aimed cameras and shouted questions at the departing agents, eager for a glimpse of the fallen executives. The words fraud, scandal, and arrest echoed in the crisp air. Quentin gently patted Christopher's shoulder. The worst is over, my friend. Now the reconstruction begins. A Greytech employee in a neatly pressed blouse approached tentatively. Mr. Gray, she asked, eyes bright with concern, is the company shutting down? Christopher shook his head. No, we're not closing our doors. We'll continue working, but with more transparency and renewed integrity. Please tell your colleagues we'll do all we can to protect their jobs. She offered a tentative smile, relief shining in her eyes. Thank you. We believe in Greytech. We believe in you. Quentin gave Christopher a nod. I can help you form an interim leadership committee, run the finances while we untangle the damage. Christopher turned to Margaret. Mom, I know you stepped away after Dad died, but I could use your guidance if you're willing. She blinked, clearly emotional. I never expected to be involved again, but I see now this is a second chance to honor your father's memory the right way. So yes, of course. A few yards away, Hannah stood quietly, giving them space. She felt a delicate mixture of pride and sadness. She'd contributed to clearing John Gray's name, but she couldn't erase the pain of the past. Christopher caught her eye, and with unspoken understanding, he crossed the space between them. How do you feel? She asked softly. Tired, relieved, proud, in a strange way, he said, exhaling a deep breath. You? Hannah glanced toward the police cars and federal vehicles outside. Like I've finally atoned for something. It doesn't bring your father back, but maybe it helps the truth come out. Christopher reached for her hand. This time, the gesture felt more natural, unburdened by old resentments. We've both come a long way. Maybe we can move forward, together, instead of being defined by what happened years ago. She squeezed his fingers gently. I'd like that. Nearby, Linda waved a phone in the air. The story's gone live. The headline is hitting the wire now. There's going to be a huge public reaction. Christopher drew a breath. Then let's face it head on. Greytech is under new leadership, and we'll prove to the world that the company my father built can still stand for something honorable." A hush of solemn triumph fell over them. The swirl of staff, agents, and media set the stage for a moment that felt both chaotic and full of promise. Outside, the winter sun shone brightly, reflecting off the glass facade of Greytech's headquarters. In that light, Christopher felt a subtle warmth. No matter the legal battles ahead, no matter how steep the road to rebuild, he'd taken the righteous path, and that, in itself, was a reward more enduring than any fortune. He looked at Hannah, then Margaret, then Quentin. They each offered hopeful smiles. Together, they stepped through the lobby doors and into a new future, uncertain, yet unburdened by deceit, ready to reshape the legacy of Greytech in a spirit of transparency and moral conviction. A month had passed since the dramatic events that rocked Greytech's leadership. Snow still dusted the streets of Denver, but the frantic swirl of federal investigations had settled into a steady march of legal proceedings. Christopher Gray walked into his private office on the 20th floor, feeling a wave of déjà vu. Yet so much had changed that even the familiar space bore the imprint of transformation. He'd spent countless hours reorganizing the company's leadership structure, working with external auditors, and reassuring anxious employees. In that time, Randall Fisher and Maxwell Crane remained in custody, awaiting trial. 2 other board members had resigned in disgrace to avoid further scrutiny. The general mood among the staff was a curious mix of relief and uncertainty, as if everyone sensed a shift in the wind. Christopher sank into the leather chair that once belonged to his father. The morning sunlight bathed the desk, illuminating the photos he kept there, one of John Gray smiling triumphantly at a product launch years ago, another of his mother, Margaret, in happier days. A pang of bittersweet emotion swept through him. Even after the truth came out about corruption within the ranks, he still wished he could share these victories and heartbreaks with his father. He glanced at the updated organizational chart pinned to a corkboard by the window. A new CFO, carefully selected for integrity and skill, stood at the helm of the finance department. An interim board of directors, appointed by a shareholder vote, was now guiding the company forward. It was a radical change, almost unimaginable a few months earlier, but necessary. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Hannah Sullivan stepped in, carrying a folder. The lines of fatigue around her eyes spoke of late nights working on follow-up investigations, but she appeared steadier and more composed than before. "Got a minute?" she asked. Christopher managed a small smile. "Of course." She handed him the folder. "Linda wants to run an in-depth piece on Greytech's restructuring, an inside look at how the company is recovering from corruption. I told her you might be open to it." He flipped through the pages, scanning the proposed interview topics. "I am open to it," he said, glancing up, "as long as it's honest. The public deserves to know how we're cleaning house." Hannah nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She paused, eyes drifting to the framed photo of John Gray on the desk. "I heard from the federal prosecutor's office that new evidence suggests your father wasn't involved in any wrongdoing years ago. Maxwell and Randall might have shifted blame to him when he stumbled on early signs of the fraud." Christopher's gaze lingered on the photograph. "It's a relief to hear that. My mother told me he always suspected some hidden scheme but couldn't pin it down. I wish he'd had the support we have now." Hannah's expression turned pensive. "I'm sorry he had to carry that burden alone, and I'm sorry for my role in, well, you know." He reached over to give her hand a brief, gentle squeeze. "We can't rewrite the past, but we've done our best to set things right." She met his eyes, gratitude softening her features. "You're different these days, quieter maybe, but there's a strength in you. It's like you've let go of some old ghosts." He sighed. "I'm trying." Exposing corruption came with a price. Sleepless nights, legal chaos, the risk of a corporate meltdown. But it also forced me to confront the myths I built around my father, around grey tech. Now I see we're stronger for facing the truth. A companionable silence settled. The hum of the city drifted through the windows. Hannah stepped toward the door. "Take a break if you can. You've been pushing yourself non-stop. Maybe you should visit your mother. She mentioned wanting to see more of you." Christopher nodded, standing to walk her out. "I will. In fact, I'm heading to Boston tomorrow." They left the office, passing employees who greeted Christopher with cautious smiles. The shifts in the atmosphere were subtle but telling. Some nodded with respect, others simply exuded relief that a new chapter had begun. Rumors of large layoffs had subsided, replaced by cautious optimism. Back in the lobby, the Greytech name still shone in polished metal letters on the wall. But to Christopher's eyes, it gleamed differently now. Perhaps it was the reflection of a revived conscience, a company standing on the edge of rebirth. He lingered by the reception desk, remembering how only weeks ago federal agents roamed these halls, collecting evidence, carting away boxes of incriminating files. Now, although legal investigations would continue for months, if not years, there was a sense of calm, a quiet aftermath. Turning to leave, Christopher felt a mixture of vulnerability and renewal, as though his own spirit had been tested and reforged. There were still battles to fight, a board to stabilize, public trust to regain. But for the first time in a long while, he sensed he was truly free from the weight of old shadows. Later that week, Christopher stood on the doorstep of his childhood home in Boston, a modest two-story house where Margaret Gray had chosen to remain after John Gray's passing. The crisp air carried hints of salt from the nearby harbor. He knocked gently, feeling an odd flutter of nerves despite this being the house he grew up in. Margaret answered the door with a warm but subdued smile. "Chris," she murmured, "thank you for coming." She stepped back, allowing him inside. The living room looked the same as ever, worn floral-patterned sofa, neatly arranged bookshelves, and an old piano against the wall. It was a far cry from the upscale penthouse Christopher now called home. But the familiarity eased something within him. He realized how much he'd missed these walls, the comfort of a mother's presence. They shared a quiet hug before settling on the sofa. Margaret poured them tea, the steam curling into the space between them. She studied her son's face, as though trying to gauge the depths of change within him. "I followed every news update," she said softly, placing the teapot down. "At first, it was frightening. FBI raids, arrests, but seeing how you handled it, I realized you're stronger than I ever imagined." Christopher shook his head gently. "For a while, I wasn't sure I could shoulder it all. But there were people who stepped in. Quentin, Hannah, others. They helped me carry the weight." Margaret's gaze flickered at the mention of Hannah, but she kept her expression neutral. "And your father's name is being cleared. There's talk among the investigators that he'd actually confronted certain executives years ago, only to be undermined. That's why the accusations fell on him. Paul Renfield says the ongoing investigations will expose the full story eventually," Christopher replied, picking up his cup. "I wish Dad were here to see that happen." Margaret leaned back, crossing her hands in her lap. "So do I. But in a way, this is a homecoming for both of you, carrying his legacy forward in a truer form, free from secrets." He glanced around the room, noticing framed photos on the mantel. One of John Gray shaking hands with a senator at a charity event, another of a much younger Christopher in a Little League uniform. "I used to resent these pictures," he admitted quietly. "They reminded me of a standard I was never sure I could meet." Now I see them differently." Margaret reached for his hand. "I'm sorry if I ever contributed to that pressure. Your father loved you, but he was often consumed by building Greytech. Maybe he forgot how that might feel for you." Christopher's throat tightened, old wounds surfacing alongside a sense of resolution. "I used to blame Dad for leaving me this empire and all its hidden problems. But the truth is, he gave me a chance to learn and to stand up against corruption. I think that's a legacy worth respecting." Margaret's eyes shone. For a while, they spoke of simpler times, winter vacations, summer barbecues, the day Christopher first went off to college. The conversation meandered through nostalgia, weaving past regrets into new understandings. Eventually, Margaret excused herself to fetch a family photo album. While she was gone, Christopher stood and wandered to the piano. He trailed his fingers over the keys, but did not press them. The memory of music lessons drifted through his mind, the frustration of hitting the wrong notes, and his father's affectionate encouragement to try again. When Margaret returned, she brought not just the album, but also a thin manila folder. "I found this in your father's old study last week." She handed it to Christopher. Letters, rough drafts of business proposals. He wrote about certain suspicions. I think he was gathering evidence about the CFO and a few others. Christopher carefully opened the folder, scanning a page of his father's handwritten notes. Phrases jumped out: meeting with Randall uncertain, strange bank records, need to protect the company from internal harm. A swell of emotion rose in Christopher's chest. "He was trying," Margaret said softly. "He just never had the backing he needed." Christopher closed his eyes briefly, imagining his father's final days of turmoil, carrying the weight of accusations alone. "We've come full circle," he murmured. "Dad would be relieved to know we're clearing Greytech's name, despite the cost." Margaret set the photo album aside, placing a gentle hand on Christopher's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son. You've been through a battle, moral, legal, and personal. But you emerged with your conscience intact. That matters more than you know." He turned to face his mother, embracing her tightly. The softness in her voice, the warmth of her touch, all reminded him that while the world had grown complicated, some bonds remained unshakable. Stepping back, Margaret smiled. "Stay the night, if you can. There's a guest room made up for you. You've worked enough for a lifetime. Maybe it's time to pause and rest." Christopher looked around, feeling both renewed and vulnerable in this familiar setting. The hush of the house soothed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I think I'd like that," he said. "Thank you, Mom." In the stillness of the late afternoon light, he realized he'd finally returned home, not just physically, but with a soul unburdened. He was, indeed, a changed man, capable of facing the ordinary world with transformed eyes. A brisk winter breeze swept over Manhattan as Christopher, Hannah, and Quentin took to a small stage set up in Greytech's New York office lobby. Rows of chairs held employees, reporters, and a few invited guests. At the podium, Christopher prepared to address them all, a significant milestone since the scandal erupted. The moment felt monumental, a chance to demonstrate renewed transparency. In the front row, Margaret Gray and Linda Atwood watched with anticipation. Several cameras flashed, capturing the scene for local media. Hannah's notes lay in a neat stack on a side table. She would speak after Christopher, offering a journalist's perspective on corporate accountability. Clearing his throat, Christopher gripped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "In the past few months, Greytech has faced challenges that threatened our stability and tested our integrity. We uncovered fraud, saw key executives arrested, and endured a wave of public scrutiny. Yet through it all, our employees have shown resilience, dedication, and courage." A low murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Some staff members looked uneasy, still uncertain about the company's future. But curiosity and hope glimmered in their eyes. Christopher continued, "I want to share what we've learned. First, no organization, no matter how successful, is immune to deception. Second, honesty might be painful in the short term, but it's the only path to a stronger, healthier enterprise." Hannah exchanged a small smile with Quentin, recalling the harrowing nights in Aspen and Denver. The transformation from secrecy to open acknowledgement was striking. Christopher seemed calmer, more centered, no longer haunted by ghosts but motivated by a clear vision. He gestured to the front row. "We have new partnerships with independent auditors, outside counsel, and whistleblower advocacy groups. Together, we aim to create a safe environment where wrongdoing can't hide. Our motto now is simple: integrity above all." A modest wave of applause followed, and Christopher stepped aside to let Hannah approach the mic. In her tailored blazer and poised stance, she looked every bit the seasoned investigative reporter, a far cry from the woman found unconscious on a hotel floor. Hannah glanced around, her voice steady. "I'm here not just as a journalist, but as someone who witnessed firsthand how corruption threatens to undermine a company's mission. When Christopher and I discovered illegal activities within Greytech, the choice became clear: speak up or allow criminal behavior to continue. We chose to expose it, no matter the consequences." She caught Christopher's eye, recalling their uneasy alliance that had blossomed into trust. Because of that decision, Greytech stands on the verge of a new era, one that values ethics over shortcuts. I believe that story is worth telling, not just for Greytech, but for every corporation that grapples with ethical dilemmas. Quentin took the podium next, offering a brief summary of the internal reforms underway: financial oversight, transparent reporting, and a reshuffled board. A few employees asked questions, expressing concerns about job security or the potential impact on stock prices. Quentin and Christopher answered honestly, emphasizing a commitment to keeping the workforce informed and involved. The session ended with respectful applause. As the crowd dispersed, employees filing back to their tasks, Hannah mingled with a few reporters, exchanging contact details. Meanwhile, Christopher stepped away with Margaret, who beamed at him. "You've grown into a real leader," she said quietly. His cheeks warmed slightly. "I just hope the staff sees that this isn't a publicity stunt. We want genuine change." Margaret touched his arm, her voice gentle. "They'll see it in your actions, not just your words. You've already done more than most leaders ever dare." Hannah approached, glancing between mother and son. "I'm heading to the next press briefing. Linda's got me lined up for an interview on corporate transparency." Christopher gave a nod of encouragement. "Good luck. And thank you for standing up there with me." She offered a humble smile. "We share this victory, Christopher. We all do." In that moment, the sunlight streaming through the glass atrium seemed to highlight the sense of collective redemption. Margaret took in the scene: the once guarded CEO, the repentant journalist, the dedicated auditor, each carried scars from the past, but those very scars had fused them into a stronger alliance. Before leaving, Hannah leaned in to whisper, "We've come so far, haven't we?" He nodded, recalling the fear in Aspen, the tense boardroom confrontation, the swirling legal drama. "So far," he echoed. "And there's still more to do. But at least now we're not doing it alone." They parted ways, each heading to their respective tasks. The transformation of Greytech was no longer an intangible goal, but an evolving reality. Through speeches, policy changes, and renewed moral clarity, the company was finding its footing on higher ground. In the quiet that followed, Christopher lingered in the lobby, watching sunlight dance across the sleek floors. For the first time since assuming the CEO mantle, he felt a sense of genuine peace. The burdens of secrecy were lifted, replaced by the shared lessons of integrity, courage, and the knowledge that resilience was possible when people joined forces for what was right. The winter chill in Denver had given way to the first stirrings of spring. Subtle blossoms pushed through the frost in the city's parks, and a gentle thaw seeped into the streets. In Christopher Gray's personal life, the season of renewal reflected his own transformation. He stood on a small bridge spanning a narrow creek in one of Denver's public gardens, gazing at the water rushing below. The echo of the past month's turmoil felt distant, as if contained to newspaper clippings and archived broadcast footage. Graytech's board had stabilized under an interim leadership council. Employees were optimistic about the future. The legal cases against Randall Fisher, Maxwell Crane, and their cohorts were progressing, though final resolutions remained months away. Hannah strolled over, joining him at the railing. She wore a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the quiet contentment Christopher felt. "I checked in with Linda this morning," she said. "The article on Graytech's ethical reforms has been well received. Comments online suggest people admire the openness you're promoting." Christopher nodded, letting his gaze linger on the flowing creek. "It's not easy to change a corporate culture overnight, but we're on the right track. The staff genuinely wants to be part of a better company. That means more to me than quarterly profits right now." She slipped her arm gently through his, and they walked along the path. The garden was dotted with early blooms, pale crocuses and budding tulips. Nearby, a few children laughed, tossing bread to ducks in a small pond. The site radiated a soft, hopeful energy. They found a bench beneath a willow tree, its delicate branches swaying in the breeze. Sitting down, Christopher glanced at Hannah. "So, what about you? Is the story finished?" She shrugged. "A journalist's work is never truly done. I'll keep following the trial when it begins. There could be more twists, especially if Randall cuts a plea deal, but I'm also considering a new direction, maybe focusing on pieces that highlight ethical business models and investigative reporting that leads to constructive change." He smiled. "That sounds purposeful." A quiet moment passed, the hush of nature embracing them. Hannah's voice softened. "Do you ever think about how this all started? That split-second decision you made to enter the wrong hotel room?" Christopher chuckled, though it held a note of wonder. "One small misstep with my key card, and everything changed. It's as if fate pushed us together for a reason." She nodded, a thoughtful gleam in her eyes. "I'm grateful it did, though the journey was terrifying at times. I never imagined I'd be working alongside the son of John Gray, or forging something deeper." His heart warmed at that admission, and he gently took her hand. "I never expected to trust the reporter who once tarnished my father's name. But life has a strange way of offering second chances." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, hands entwined, each lost in thoughts of the past and the future. In the distance, city buildings loomed, a reminder of the responsibilities that still awaited. But here, by the creek, they were free to reflect on how far they had come and how much they had grown. Eventually, Hannah rose, pulling Christopher to his feet. "Come on," she said with a playful tug. "I believe you promised to show me your father's old reading spots. Weren't there a few bookstores in town he loved?" He laughed softly, letting her lead. "I did mention that, didn't I?" They wandered out of the garden, finding Christopher's car parked on a nearby street. As they drove, the conversation turned to lighter topics, childhood memories, shared dreams for the future, and half-joking speculation about whether or not they should write a book on the entire ordeal. Before long, they reached a cozy bookstore tucked between brick buildings, just as John Gray had described it years before. Christopher parked and paused for a moment, hand lingering on the keys. "I feel him here," he admitted. "It's like retracing his steps, but this time without all the secrets." Hannah gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "That's what growth looks like, carrying your past with you, but not letting it define you. You're shaping your own path now, Christopher." With that, they stepped onto the sidewalk, the bookstore's bell chiming overhead as they entered. The scent of old pages and new possibilities enveloped them. Christopher inhaled deeply, letting the moment anchor him to the present. For all the heartbreak and chaos that had led them here, something profoundly good had emerged. A renewed sense of purpose for Grey Tech, a deeper understanding of John Gray's legacy, and a bond between Christopher and Hannah that neither had anticipated. Standing among shelves of stories, Christopher felt a quiet surge of contentment. He might still face legal battles, corporate upheavals, and personal reckonings, but he was no longer the man bound by fear and the weight of unspoken truths. He was free to forge a legacy rooted in honesty and hope. In that peace, he realized the final chapter of this long trial was, in fact, a beginning of new love, new leadership, and a future shaped by the hard-won promise of integrity. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.